Niccolo Machiavelli is the thinker who dared to say out loud what everyone else only practiced in secret. He stripped politics of morality and forced us to see the game of power as it really is: ruthless, calculated, indifferent to virtue. While others painted rulers as guardians of justice, Machiavelli wrote with chilling honesty, "It is better to be feared than loved, and appearances matter more than truth." His philosophy is not just about Renaissance princes. It is about anyone who leads: CEOs, presidents, generals, even parents managing a household. He asked a haunting question: if you want to survive in a dangerous world, can you afford to be good? Or must you sometimes lie, betray, and manipulate in order to protect yourself and those you lead? The shock of Machiavelli lies in his candor. He did not invent corruption or cruelty. He simply admitted they exist. And in doing so, he turned morality on its head. Instead of asking, "What should make a ruler good?" he asked, "What actually keeps a ruler in power?" That shift is what makes him feel modern, even 5 centuries later. To appreciate just how radical this was, we must remember the intellectual climate of Machiavelli's world. For centuries, political thought had been wrapped in the language of virtue, religion, and morality. Medieval writers often described rulers as shepherds entrusted by God to care for their flock. Kings were to be just, merciful, and pious. Power was framed as a sacred duty, meant to protect and elevate the people. In this framework, a bad ruler was one who failed to embody Christian virtues. Machiavelli shattered that ideal. He insisted that politics cannot be judged by the same standards as personal morality. A ruler may wish to be merciful, faithful, or honest, but if such virtues endanger the stability of the state, then they must be abandoned. What matters is not whether a leader is good, but whether they are effective. The true measure of leadership is survival, security, and the preservation of power. In his words, a prince who wishes to maintain his state must learn how not to be good, and to use or not use this knowledge as necessity requires. It was as if Machiavelli had ripped the mask from the face of power and demanded that we look at it in the harsh light of reality. Leaders, he argued, must deal with human beings as they are, not as they ought to be. Fickle, self-interested, easily swayed by appearances, and prone to betrayal when it suits their advantage. A ruler who depends on their loyalty, he warned, builds on sand. A ruler who commands their fear, however, builds on stone. The distinction between love and fear is perhaps his most famous insight. Love is voluntary, it is given freely, and therefore it can be withdrawn just as freely. Fear, by contrast, is involuntary. It binds people through their instinct for self-preservation. Machiavelli acknowledged that both love and fear are desirable, but since a ruler cannot always have both, fear is the safer choice. Yet he added a crucial caveat: a wise ruler must avoid being hated. Fear without hatred can sustain obedience. Fear mixed with hatred breeds rebellion, which is the one force that can topple even the most secure prince. What is striking is how this principle extends beyond politics in the narrow sense. Consider the modern workplace. A manager who relies only on being liked may find that loyalty evaporates the moment tough decisions are required. A manager who rules by intimidation may provoke resentment and sabotage. The art of leadership, Machiavelli would say, lies in striking a balance, feared enough to be respected, but not so cruel as to provoke hatred. This is why Machiavelli still feels uncomfortably relevant. His philosophy applies not only to princes of the Renaissance, but to presidents, generals, and executives in every age. He forces us to confront questions we would rather avoid. Can power ever be purely moral? Or is survival always tinged with deception and force? Another of Machiavelli's insights was the importance of appearances. People, he argued, judge more by what they see than by what they know. A ruler should therefore cultivate an image of virtue, even if he does not practice it. Appear generous, though you are frugal. Appear merciful, though you are ruthless when necessary. Appear religious, even if faith is a tool of control. For the masses, appearances shape reality. This, too, is a principle that echoes into modern politics, where image-making and public relations often matter more than substance. It would be easy to dismiss these observations as cynical, but for Machiavelli, cynicism was a form of honesty. He had seen too much of the world to indulge in comforting illusions. He watched Florence's leaders speak of liberty and justice even as they cut deals with foreign powers and betrayed allies. He saw mercenary armies switch sides for higher pay. He saw fiery preachers call for godly reform, only to end at the stake when the winds turned against them. To him, politics was not a matter of ideals, but of necessity. And if necessity required deception, cruelty, or betrayal, then so be it. This blunt realism is what sets Machiavelli apart. Earlier writers painted politics in noble colors. Later thinkers often tried to soften his edges, to reinterpret him as a misunderstood patriot. But the enduring force of his work lies in his refusal to avert his gaze from the darker truths of human behavior. He dared to write what others would not, that the pursuit of power is often indifferent to morality, and that survival may demand actions that offend virtue. And yet, there is another side to his thought that is often forgotten. Machiavelli did not advocate cruelty for its own sake. He did not celebrate tyranny. His concern was always the stability and strength of the state. A ruler who governs with excessive violence, who provokes hatred, or who acts without regard for necessity, is a fool in his eyes. The true art of power lies in knowing when to be ruthless and when to show restraint, when to lie and when to tell the truth, when to strike and when to hold back. It is, in short, a matter of judgment, a constant negotiation between virtue and necessity. Seen in this light, Machiavelli is less a corrupter of morals and more a diagnostician of power. He describes the world not as we wish it to be, but as it is. Whether we like his conclusions or not, they continue to illuminate the realities of leadership and survival. That is why his name endures, not only as a term of abuse, but as a symbol of hard truth. Machiavelli unsettles us because he holds up a mirror we would rather not look into. We want to believe that leaders can rule through justice, that morality and politics can walk hand in hand. He reminds us that history tells a harsher story, that those who cling too tightly to virtue often fall before those who wield power without scruple. It is a lesson that no age has fully accepted, yet none can ignore. In this sense, Machiavelli belongs not just to the Renaissance, but to every generation that struggles with the uneasy marriage of power and morality. His words still resonate because the dilemmas he described are still with us, in politics, in business, in war, and in the choices we make when faced with hard realities. Machiavelli began with the simple, unsettling claim that it is better to be feared than loved. From that starting point, he unfolded a vision of politics stripped of illusions, guided by necessity, and rooted in the fragile but enduring truths of human behavior. It is this vision that has made him one of the most controversial, most reviled, and most indispensable thinkers in history. To understand Machiavelli, we must begin not with his writings, but with his city. Florence in the late 15th century was both dazzling and dangerous, a place where the heights of artistic brilliance coexisted with the depths of political instability. It was a republican name, with councils and assemblies that claimed to represent the voice of the people, but in practice it was often dominated by factions and powerful families. It was a city of beauty and betrayal, of patronage and conspiracy, of Michelangelo's David standing only a short walk from the square where public executions drew cheering crowds. Niccolò Machiavelli was born into this world on May 3, 1469. His family was neither poor nor powerful. His father, Bernardo, was a lawyer, a man of modest means who nonetheless valued books and learning. Their home was not one of luxury, but it held shelves of manuscripts, including classical works of Roman history and philosophy. The young Niccolò absorbed these texts, and they planted in him a fascination with politics and the cycles of human fortune. Rome, in the writings of Livy and Tacitus, became his first classroom, a republic rising through civic virtue, then declining through corruption. These early lessons would later surface in his own reflections on Florence. But Machiavelli's education did not take place only in books. Florence itself was a teacher, and its lessons were harsh. During his youth, the Medici family dominated the city. Wealthy bankers whose influence reached across Europe, they ruled Florence with a mixture of cunning and splendor. They sponsored artists, scholars, and architects, turning the city into a jewel of the Renaissance. Yet their power was resented. In 1494, when Machiavelli was 25, the Medici were overthrown in a popular uprising, and Florence declared itself a republic once more. This moment of upheaval would mark him deeply. Into the vacuum stepped Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose fiery sermons denounced corruption and called for moral renewal. Under his sway, Florence experienced a wave of puritanical zeal. Luxuries were cast into bonfires, citizens patrolled each other's morality, and fear mixed uneasily with devotion. For a time, Savonarola seemed to embody the fusion of politics and religion, promising that Florence would become God's chosen city. The preacher who had ruled through moral authority fell victim to the same forces he once commanded. Arrested, tortured, and executed in the very square where he had rallied the people, Savonarola's downfall was a living lesson in the volatility of power. For Machiavelli, watching this must have been formative. He saw how swiftly fortune changes, how crowds shift from adoration to hatred, how ideals can be swept away when survival is threatened. Savonarola's story revealed the fragility of ruling by love and faith alone. It demonstrated in stark detail that appearances, though powerful, are easily shattered when events turn against them. Such experiences were not abstractions to Machiavelli. They were the living theater of politics, unfolding before his eyes in the streets of his own city. Florence itself was a crucible of contrasts. On the one hand, it was the beating heart of Renaissance culture. Painters like Botticelli, sculptors like Michelangelo, and thinkers like Marsilio Ficino flourished under its patronage. Art, philosophy, and science advanced with astonishing speed. On the other hand, the city was perpetually threatened by external enemies and internal divisions. Venice, Milan, Naples, France, Spain, and the papacy all sought influence in Italy, and Florence often found itself caught in the crossfire. Armies marched across its countryside. Alliances were made and broken with dizzying regularity. In such a world, security was fragile and survival uncertain. This environment shaped Machiavelli in profound ways. He grew up in a household where education was prized, but wealth was scarce, where books offered a vision of Rome's glory, but the streets revealed the chaos of Italian politics. He witnessed the collapse of Medici power, the rise and fall of Savonarola, and the fragile experiment of republican government that followed. He learned that power was never stable, that fortune was unpredictable, and that politics was as much about perception as about principle. It is telling that Machiavelli did not belong to the ruling elite. He was not born into privilege or destined for high office by lineage. His entry into public service would come later, not through inheritance but through ability. This outsider's position gave him a clarity others lacked. He could see both the lofty ideals proclaimed by rulers and the raw calculations that actually guided their actions. He was neither blinded by aristocratic entitlement nor sheltered from the harshness of political reality. In the years before he entered public service, Machiavelli absorbed Florence's contradictions. He studied the classics, learning how the Roman Republic built its power through citizen armies and institutions of shared responsibility. He watched his own city struggle with corruption, factionalism, and foreign interference. He saw religion wielded as a tool of power and then discarded when it no longer served. He lived in a society where fortunes could reverse overnight, where today's leader could be tomorrow's exile, and where appearances mattered as much as reality. These were the formative influences that would later shape his philosophy. When he wrote that rulers must be prepared to act against faith, charity, or truth if necessity demands it, he was not speaking from theory alone. He had seen Savonarola destroyed by his insistence on divine authority. When he warned that mercenary armies are dangerous, he was reflecting on the instability that plagued Italy's city-states. When he insisted that appearances can sustain power, even when substance is lacking, he was recalling the pageantry of the Medici, who cloaked domination in magnificence. The Florence of Machiavelli's youth was therefore more than a backdrop. It was the forge in which his ideas were hammered into shape. Every crisis, every uprising, every shifting alliance contributed to his conviction that politics must be studied as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. The city was a living laboratory, and Machiavelli was its most attentive student. By the time he entered the Chancery in 1498, Machiavelli carried with him both the lessons of the ancients and the brutal realities of his own age. He was prepared not only to serve, but to observe, to record, and eventually to interpret. His thought would never be confined to abstract ideals. It would always be tied to the living, breathing, often ruthless reality of Florence and Italy in crisis. In this sense, Machiavelli's early life illustrates a theme as old as philosophy itself, that ideas do not emerge in isolation. They are forged in the crucible of lived experience, shaped by family, culture, and the turbulent world around us. His family gave him books, his city gave him turmoil, and together they made him a thinker who would one day dare to write the unvarnished truth about power. In 1498, Florence underwent another of its many transformations. The fiery preacher Savonarola had been executed, the Medici remained in exile, and the city was once again a republic. Its institutions were fragile, but for a moment, Florence attempted self-rule through councils and elected officials. It was in this shifting environment that Niccolò Machiavelli found his place. At 29 years old, he was appointed to a post in the Second Chancery, the office responsible for foreign affairs and official correspondence. It was not the highest position in government, but it was one of enormous consequence. For Machiavelli, it was the beginning of a career that would expose him to the realities of power at every level. The Chancery was the nerve center of Florence's diplomacy. Its members drafted letters, prepared reports, and dispatched envoys to courts across Italy and beyond. In a Europe dominated by kings and popes, Florence had no army of its own to project power, and no vast territory to guarantee security. Its strength lay in negotiation, alliance, and subtle maneuvering. To work in the Chancery was to step directly into this delicate balancing act, and Machiavelli quickly proved himself capable. His role took him far beyond Florence. He traveled to the French court, where he observed the magnificence of monarchy and the arrogance of kings. He negotiated with emissaries of the Pope, where religion mingled openly with ambition. He dealt with condottieri, the mercenary captains who rented out their armies to the highest bidder, and saw firsthand how loyalty could vanish the moment coinage stopped flowing. It was here, in these encounters, that Machiavelli developed one of his strongest convictions, that mercenaries are ruinous. Hired soldiers, he argued, fight for profit, not for loyalty. They abandon the battlefield when danger outweighs reward, and they are quick to betray if an enemy offers more. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous, he would later write, and those words carried the weight of bitter experience. One figure, however, left a deeper impression than any other: Cesare Borgia. The son of Pope Alexander VI, Borgia carved out a domain for himself in central Italy through a mixture of audacity, cunning, and brutality. Florence, wary of his ambition, sent Machiavelli as an envoy to his court. There, Machiavelli witnessed a masterclass in the ruthless exercise of power. Borgia moved decisively against rivals, eliminating them before they could act against him. He used cruelty not randomly, but strategically, making examples of enemies in ways that terrified others into obedience. He shifted alliances without hesitation, treating promises as tools to be discarded when they no longer served. And through it all, he projected an image of strength, even when fortune weakened his position. For Machiavelli, Cesare Borgia became a living illustration of the principles he would later articulate in The Prince. Borgia's downfall, caused by the sudden death of his father and the election of a hostile new pope, did not erase the lessons he embodied. On the contrary, it revealed another crucial truth: that fortune can undo even the boldest of men, but boldness remains the best strategy against fortune's unpredictability. From Borgia, Machiavelli learned not only the value of decisiveness and ruthlessness, but also the limits of human control. During these years, Machiavelli also rose to greater responsibility at home. He became secretary to the Council of Ten, the body that oversaw foreign affairs and defense. In this capacity, he pushed for reforms that revealed his deeper political convictions. Chief among them was his campaign to create a citizen militia. He believed that a republic cannot rely on mercenaries if it wishes to remain free. Only citizens, he argued, will fight with true commitment, for they defend not a wage but their own homes and liberties. Inspired by his readings of Roman history, Machiavelli envisioned a Florence where ordinary men bore arms in defense of their republic, just as Roman citizens had defended theirs. The project had mixed results. The militia was never as strong or disciplined as he hoped, and Florence continued to rely at times on hired soldiers. Yet the very attempt reveals much about Machiavelli's values. He was not a simple cynic glorifying manipulation and cruelty. He believed in civic strength, in the engagement of citizens, and in the possibility of a republic sustained by its own people. If The Prince represents his realism about power, the Discourses on Livy, written later, shows this republican idealism. The two are not contradictions, but two sides of the same vision, one for the fragile moment of crisis, the other for the long-term flourishing of free states. As a diplomat and secretary, Machiavelli witnessed the constant instability of Italy. He saw foreign armies march across its territories, kings and popes treating the peninsula as a battlefield for their ambitions. He observed treaties signed and broken in the span of weeks, rulers who rose one month and fell the next. In such a world, the ideals of stability and virtue seemed fragile, almost naive. What mattered was agility, decisiveness, and the ability to adapt to fortune's turns. These were the lessons he absorbed, and these were the lessons he would later set down in his writings. Yet, behind his official duties, one can imagine the man himself, writing reports by candlelight after long days of negotiation, observing every gesture of the men he met, noting the gap between their words and their actions. Machiavelli was, above all, a student of power, not in the abstract, but in the flesh. He saw that behind every noble speech, there was calculation. Behind every promise, there was leverage. Behind every act of generosity, there was strategy. It was not cynicism so much as clarity, born of relentless observation. These years of service formed his apprenticeship. They gave him first-hand exposure to the mechanics of politics, to the precariousness of alliances, and to the fragile balance between fear and love, loyalty and betrayal. They confirmed his belief that power must be studied as it truly operates, not as moralists claim it should. He had seen too much to believe otherwise. But if these were years of growth, they were also years perched on the edge of disaster. Florence remained vulnerable, and the Medici, though exiled, had not disappeared. They waited, patient and determined, for their chance to return. When they did, in 1512, the republic that had nurtured Machiavelli's career would collapse, and with it, his life in public service. For now, however, we see him in the full energy of his middle years, a servant of the republic, a diplomat to kings and popes, a critic of mercenaries, and an admirer of boldness in the face of fortune. His writings had not yet been composed, but the experiences that would shape them were already engraved on his mind. The Florence he served was fragile, but it provided him with the education of a lifetime. It was an education in survival, in deception, in the precarious balance between ideals and necessity. And it was this education, lived in the service of the Republic, that made Machiavelli into the thinker whose words still unsettle us centuries later. By 1512, Niccolò Machiavelli had built a career as one of Florence's most active public servants. He had traveled as an envoy to foreign courts, witnessed the grandeur of kings and the corruption of popes, and negotiated with mercenary captains whose loyalty was measured only in coin. He had pushed for the creation of a citizen militia, convinced that a republic should be defended by its own people rather than by hired swords. For more than a decade, he had poured his energy into strengthening the fragile Florentine Republic. Yet, in that year, all his work collapsed in a single sweep of fortune. The Medici, Florence's former rulers, returned to power backed by foreign arms, and Machiavelli's world was overturned. The return of the Medici was not simply a political shift. It was a reversal of everything Machiavelli had stood for. He had served the Republic faithfully, championed its independence, and tied his identity to its survival. When Spanish troops, allied with Pope Julius II, marched into Italy, Florence was too weak to resist. The Medici rode into the city not as humble exiles but as triumphant masters. For the Republicans, it was a moment of despair. For Machiavelli, it was personal ruin. His enemies wasted no time. As a well-known figure of the Republican government, Machiavelli was immediately suspect. Accusations circulated that he had conspired against the new regime. Whether true or not mattered little. In times of upheaval, suspicion alone was enough to condemn. Machiavelli was arrested, thrown into prison, and subjected to torture. Contemporary accounts suggest he was put to the strappado, a brutal method in which a prisoner's hands are tied behind the back and then hoisted by a rope, wrenching the shoulders and inflicting searing pain. For weeks he remained in custody, enduring humiliation and fear. Here was no powerful manipulator, no schemer in shadows, but a man broken physically and stripped of dignity. He had given years of service to Florence, yet the city he loved now treated him as a traitor. In his letters from this period, one hears not the voice of the confident diplomat, but of a man on the edge of despair, uncertain if he would ever see freedom again. His release came not from vindication, but from circumstance. In March of 1513, Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X. In celebration, an amnesty was declared, and Machiavelli was among those freed. He was not restored to his office. He was not forgiven or welcomed back into political life. He was dismissed, discarded, and effectively exiled from the affairs of state. His career in government was finished. He retreated to a small estate outside Florence, in Sant'Andrea in Percasina. There, stripped of the daily business that had consumed him for more than a decade, he faced an emptiness that weighed heavily. He wrote to friends of his isolation, his financial struggles, his frustration at being cast aside. He confessed to feeling restless, cut off from the city he loved, condemned to obscurity. The man who had once negotiated with kings and popes now passed his days in rural quiet, conversing with farmers and tradesmen, and spending evenings alone with his books. Yet exile did not silence him. If anything, it gave him time and space to reflect. In one of his most famous letters, written to his friend Francesco Vittori, Machiavelli described his daily routine. By day, he labored on his farm, mingling with peasants and dealing with mundane matters. But when night came, he put on his finest robes, as though preparing for an audience. He entered his study, opened the works of classical authors, and conversed with them as equals. In those hours, he lived not in obscurity, but in the company of Livy, Tacitus, and the great thinkers of Rome. He questioned them, listened to their wisdom, and tested their ideas against his own experience. It was in this setting, in exile and humiliation, that Machiavelli began to write the works that would secure his place in history. He was cut off from power, but he remained a student of power. The Prince, his most notorious book, emerged from these years. Written not as an abstract treatise, but as a response to the world he had lived and lost, it distilled the lessons he had learned from diplomacy, from war, from Florence's fragility, and from the audacity of men like Cesare Borgia. Exile transformed him. He had been a practitioner, directly engaged in politics, but now he became an observer and analyst. The pain of his fall sharpened his vision. Having lost everything, he no longer needed to flatter illusions. He could describe politics in its rawest form, without concern for reputation. The Prince was not the work of a triumphant minister, but of a man who had been broken and cast aside, yet who still refused to avert his gaze from the harsh realities of power. It is worth pausing to see how suffering shapes thought. Many of the greatest philosophical works arise not from stability, but from collapse, not from success, but from failure. Augustine wrote after the sack of Rome, grappling with the disintegration of an empire. Descartes sought certainty in the aftermath of religious wars that had torn Europe apart. Nietzsche's most radical works came during his own illness and isolation. For Machiavelli, it was prison, torture, and exile that stripped away the last remnants of illusion and left him face to face with the raw core of politics. What emerges from this period is not simply bitterness. He did not turn his back on the world. Instead, he turned to analysis, as if determined to wrest meaning from his suffering. His books became the arena where he could continue the struggle he had once fought in council chambers and embassies. If he could no longer shape politics directly, he would at least describe its true nature with unflinching honesty. Thus, the fall of the Republic did not end Machiavelli's influence. It redirected it. From exile, he produced writings that would outlast every Medici prince, every mercenary captain, every fleeting alliance. The man who had been silenced by torture and dismissal found a new voice in the pages of history. When we picture him in these years, we should not imagine only the broken prisoner. We should see also the thinker in his study at night, dressed for an imaginary audience with the ancients, conversing with Livy about Rome's republic, reflecting on the boldness of Borgia, and crafting insights that would challenge generations to come. It ended Machiavelli's career, broke his body, and humiliated his pride. But it also freed him to write. Out of his exile came a body of work that continues to unsettle and provoke, reminding us that sometimes the deepest truths emerge not from triumph, but from ruin. When Niccolo Machiavelli was cast out of public life in 1530, he could easily have vanished into obscurity. Many men in his position would have withdrawn from politics entirely, retreating into bitterness or piety. After torture, disgrace, and dismissal, he had every reason to turn his back on the world that had betrayed him. Yet Machiavelli did not disappear. He transformed his exile into a second life, one lived not in the councils of Florence, but in the pages of history. It was in this period of enforced retirement that he composed The Prince, the book that would secure his notoriety and ensure his name endured long after the fortunes of the Medici had risen and fallen again. Machiavelli's estate at Sant'Andrea in Percusina was modest. There he spent his days overseeing farm labor, tending to practical concerns, and mingling with the peasants of the countryside. But in the evenings, he became something else. In his famous letter to Francesco Vettori, written in December of 1513, Machiavelli described how he ended each day. After dealing with the muddy realities of rural life, he would return home, bathe, put on formal robes, and enter his study. There, he opened the books of the ancients. He read Livy, Tacitus, Cicero, the great chroniclers of Rome, and he engaged them in what he called an imaginary banquet. He conversed with them, questioned them, and tested their lessons against his own experiences. This was no idle pastime. For Machiavelli, the ancients were not dusty relics, but living teachers. He sought in their histories an understanding of politics stripped of illusions, politics as it truly unfolded in the clash of ambition, necessity, and fortune. His own experiences as a diplomat had shown him how fragile alliances were, how treacherous mercenaries could be, and how boldness could change the fate of a state. The Romans, he believed, had grasped similar truths in their struggles to build and maintain their republic. Now, in exile, he wove these lessons together into a new vision. It was in this crucible that The Prince took shape. The work is brief, direct, and startling in its honesty. Unlike the long discursive treatises of medieval political theory, The Prince reads like a manual, short chapters filled with hard-edged advice for rulers. Machiavelli addresses not how leaders ought to behave if they wish to be good, but how they must behave if they wish to survive. He tells princes that it is safer to be feared than loved, that promises can and should be broken when necessity requires, that cruelty, if well used, can secure power, and that appearances of virtue matter more than virtue itself. What is striking is how pragmatic the book is. It contains no appeals to divine justice, no long discussions of theology, no invocation of abstract ideals. It is written in the clear, unsentimental tone of a man who has seen too much to be fooled by noble rhetoric. In its pages we hear the voice of the diplomat who watched Cesare Borgia eliminate rivals, the secretary who saw mercenary armies betray their employers, the exile who learned that survival sometimes demands actions that offend morality. Yet The Prince was not only a manual, it was also, in its way, a plea. Machiavelli dedicated the book to Lorenzo de' Medici, hoping to win favor with the very family that had cast him out. Whether he believed they would listen to his advice, or whether he sought simply to regain employment is unclear. But the dedication reveals a man still longing for political relevance, still hoping that his insight might secure him a place, however precarious, in the service of Florence. This dual nature of the prince, both practical guide and intellectual provocation, explains much of its lasting impact. On the surface, it is advice for rulers, but beneath that surface, it is a statement about politics itself. It insists that power is governed not by morality, but by necessity, not by ideals, but by human behavior as it actually unfolds. It strips politics of its comforting illusions and confronts readers with the uncomfortable truth that survival often requires deception, force, and fear. Little wonder, then, that the book was both celebrated and condemned. To some, it was a revelation, finally exposing the hidden mechanics of power. To others, it was scandalous, an endorsement of tyranny and deceit. Over the centuries, readers have debated whether Machiavelli meant the prince sincerely or ironically, whether he was advising rulers or warning citizens, whether he was a patriot or a cynic. The ambiguity has only deepened his mystique. One way to understand The Prince is to see it as the work of a man stripped of illusions. Machiavelli had seen the republic he served collapse. He had seen loyalty rewarded with torture and exile. He had seen promises broken, alliances betrayed, and power snatched away by those bold enough to seize it. In The Prince, he distilled these experiences into a set of principles that made no room for fantasy. Politics, he argued, must be studied as it is, not as we wish it to be. It is this insistence on realism that continues to resonate. Even today, leaders quote Machiavelli, sometimes openly, more often quietly. His insights into fear, appearances, and necessity are not confined to Renaissance Italy. They are visible in modern politics, in corporate boardrooms, and in the dynamics of leadership wherever survival is at stake. His name has become a byword for manipulation and cunning, yet the enduring power of his thought lies in the honesty with which he confronted uncomfortable truths. In Exile, then, Machiavelli accomplished something remarkable. Stripped of office, disgraced in his city, and humiliated by torture, he nevertheless produced a work that outlived his contemporaries. The Medici who returned to power would one day fall again. The kings and popes he once negotiated with would fade into history. But the prince, born of his solitude and despair, would continue to provoke, unsettle, and illuminate for centuries to come. When we picture him at Sant'Andrea, we should not see only the defeated exile. We should also see the man who, in his study by candlelight, conversed with the ancients, tested their lessons against his own bitter experience, and wrote with a clarity that still forces us to confront the uneasy marriage of morality and power. Out of humiliation, he forged immortality. If the prince represents Machiavelli at his most stark and unsettling, then the Discourses on Livy reveal another side of his thought, one often overlooked, yet just as essential to understanding him, where the prince is a slim volume addressed to a single ruler, filled with advice on how to gain and hold power. The Discourses are expansive, written for citizens of a republic. They draw not on the intrigues of the Renaissance courts, but on the history of ancient Rome, which Machiavelli studied with devotion. In these pages, the cynic of the prince gives way to the civic humanist, the man who believed that the strength of a people lies in their institutions, their participation, and their willingness to fight for their own liberty. The work takes its title from the historian Livy, whose monumental history of Rome Machiavelli read and reread in exile. For him, Livy was not merely recounting a past age, he was offering lessons for the present. Rome, Machiavelli argued, rose to greatness not through the virtue of a single prince, but through the combined energy of its citizens. It was a republic, with laws and institutions that allowed for competition, ambition, and conflict, but also for resilience. Unlike the fragile city-states of Italy, constantly at the mercy of mercenaries and foreign powers, Rome built its strength on the involvement of its people. In the Discourses, Machiavelli praises Rome for embracing conflict rather than avoiding it. Many thinkers before him had treated political discord as a danger to be suppressed, but Machiavelli argued that disputes between the Senate and the people gave Rome its vitality. Out of these clashes came laws, reforms, and a balance of power that kept the Republic strong. Conflict, when channeled through institutions, was not destructive, but constructive. It prevented tyranny by forcing compromise and ensured that no single group could dominate unchecked. In this, Machiavelli sounds remarkably modern, anticipating later arguments about the value of checks and balances in government. He also returned to one of his deepest convictions, the need for citizen armies. In The Prince, he had warned against mercenaries, whose loyalty was fleeting and whose courage evaporated when danger outweighed profit. In the Discourses, he went further, declaring that a republic that does not arm its own citizens is doomed to weakness. Rome's greatness lay in the fact that its soldiers were also its citizens, men who had a direct stake in the survival of the state. They fought not for wages but for their homes and families. Florence, by contrast, had too often relied on condottieri who abandoned the field at the first sign of trouble. For Machiavelli, this was not simply a military issue, but a civic one. A republic's strength depends on the involvement and responsibility of its people. Another striking theme in the Discourses is Machiavelli's treatment of fortune. In The Prince, fortune appears as a force to be mastered by boldness. In the Discourses, it plays a broader role. Fortune is still unpredictable, but institutions, once established, can weather its storms better than individual rulers. A republic, with its distributed power and engaged citizenry, can adapt more flexibly than a monarchy tied to the fate of a single leader. Here again, Machiavelli reveals himself as more than a teacher of princes. He is a thinker of republican resilience. It is tempting to see The Prince and the Discourses as contradictory. One advocating ruthless pragmatism for princes, the other celebrating civic virtue in republics. But in truth, they are complementary. Machiavelli understood that politics unfolds on different stages. In moments of crisis, when a state is weak and survival is at stake, a leader must act decisively, even ruthlessly, as described in The Prince. But in times of stability, when a republic is secure, long-term strength comes from institutions, laws, and the active participation of citizens, as described in the Discourses. One work speaks to the emergency, the other to endurance. In this way, Machiavelli was not simply a cynic, but a realist with a wide range of vision. He could see the brutal necessities of immediate power, and he could also see the deeper foundations of freedom. His admiration for Rome was not nostalgia, it was a model. He wanted Florence, and Italy more broadly, to learn from the Roman example, to build systems that could resist corruption, channel conflict productively, and involve citizens in the defense of their liberty. The Republican, Machiavelli, the author of The Discourses, is the one who most inspired later generations. The founders of the American Republic, for instance, read him closely. John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison were drawn to his insights about the balance of power, the dangers of corruption, and the value of civic virtue. The very idea that freedom is preserved not by harmony but by tension, not by blind unity, but by structured conflict, can be traced back to Machiavelli's reading of Rome. His reputation as a teacher of tyranny obscures this legacy, but it is real and profound. What is most striking is how the same man could produce both works, The Prince and the Discourses, within a few years of each other. Together they capture the duality of his thought, the recognition that human beings are driven by self-interest, ambition, and fear, and the conviction that political order must harness these drives rather than deny them. He did not imagine a politics of saints or angels. He imagined a politics of men, as they are, sometimes cruel, often fickle, always ambitious, and he sought to design institutions that could make use of those traits, rather than be destroyed by them. In the quiet of exile, then, Machiavelli was not only reflecting on his own humiliation, but also on the broader fate of his city and his country. Italy, in his time, was fractured, vulnerable, and dominated by foreign powers. He longed for a political order strong enough to unite and defend it. The Prince offered lessons for bold leaders in moments of crisis. The Discourses offered a vision of how a free people might build lasting strength. Both works were born of the same mind, forged in the same crucible of experience, yet they spoke to different dimensions of the political life. Seen together, they show us the full Machiavelli, not merely the teacher of deceit and cruelty, but also the advocate of civic responsibility, citizen armies, and the resilience of republican institutions. His reputation may rest largely on the notoriety of The Prince, but his true contribution lies in the balance between these two works. They remind us that politics is always a dance between necessity and ideal, between immediate survival and long-term endurance. By turning to Rome, Machiavelli gave his contemporaries, and us, a mirror in which to see both the dangers and the possibilities of political life. His discourses stand as a testament to his belief that even in a world governed by ambition and fortune, there remains room for freedom, if only a people are willing to claim it for themselves. To understand Machiavelli fully, we must turn to two concepts that anchor his entire political vision: virtue and fortuna. These words, deceptively simple in Italian, carry meanings that resist easy translation. Virtue is not virtue in the moral sense, though the words share a root. In Machiavelli's usage, it means strength, skill, boldness, adaptability, the qualities that allow a leader to shape events. Fortuna, meanwhile, is fortune, chance, the unpredictable forces of life that no human being can control. Politics, for Machiavelli, is the interplay between these two forces, the capacity of human beings to act decisively, and the shifting winds of chance that can undo even the most careful plans. He often described Fortuna as a woman, unpredictable, capricious, and prone to favor those who approach her with audacity rather than timidity. Half of human affairs, he suggested, are governed by fortune, but the other half are open to human agency. A wise leader cannot master fortune completely, but he can prepare himself to resist her blows and seize her opportunities. Virtue is the quality that allows a man to stand firm when fortune rages, or to act boldly when she presents an opening. This image is more than poetic. It reflects Machiavelli's conviction that human beings are neither completely free nor completely determined. We are caught between necessity and choice. Fortune deals the cards, but virtue decides how we play them. For a ruler, this means that success lies not in passivity or reliance on divine providence, but in the capacity to act boldly, adapt to circumstances, and impose one's will upon events as far as possible. Cesare Borgia again serves as Machiavelli's favorite example. Fortune had given him advantages. He was the son of Pope Alexander VI, and with papal backing, he carved out power in central Italy. Yet fortune also betrayed him. When his father died and a hostile new pope was elected, his foundations crumbled. What Machiavelli admired was not his final failure, but his bold use of virtue while he had the chance. Borgia moved decisively against rivals, established order through calculated cruelty, and projected strength even when vulnerable. Fortune may have destroyed him, but his actions embodied the qualities Machiavelli believed essential for leadership. In this tension between virtue and fortuna, we see the heart of Machiavelli's realism. He did not promise control over destiny. He did not assure leaders that virtue in the moral sense would protect them. On the contrary, he insisted that fortune is fickle and often cruel. The only defense is to cultivate virtue, the readiness to act with boldness, the flexibility to adapt when circumstances change, the toughness to endure when fortune turns hostile. In this way, his philosophy resonates with anyone who has faced the unpredictability of life, whether in politics, business, or personal affairs. What makes his treatment distinctive is his refusal to disguise fortune's harshness. Many of his contemporaries still frame success and failure as expressions of divine will. Fortune was providence, guiding events according to a higher plan. Machiavelli stripped away that comfort. Fortune, in his view, was not the hand of God, but the chaos of the world, unpredictable and indifferent. It was a river that floods without warning, sweeping away houses and fields. We cannot stop its floods, he wrote, but we can build dikes and channels in advance. We cannot eliminate chance, but through foresight and preparation, we can limit its damage. This metaphor of the river captures his outlook perfectly. It is neither fatalistic nor naively optimistic. It acknowledges the power of forces beyond our control, while affirming the responsibility of human beings to act with intelligence and courage. Leaders who rely only on luck will be destroyed when fortune turns. Leaders who cultivate virtue give themselves the best chance to withstand her blows. It is worth noting how radical this was in Machiavelli's time. In a culture still saturated with religious explanations, he spoke of fortune not as divine destiny, but as chance. And he spoke of human agency not as submission to God's will, but as bold action in the face of uncertainty. This secular realism is one reason his writings shocked his contemporaries. Yet it is also the reason they continue to speak to modern readers, who recognize the truth of living in a world governed by both chance and choice. The interplay of virtue and fortuna also sheds light on Machiavelli's dual works, The Prince and the Discourses. In The Prince, he emphasizes the need for boldness in moments of crisis, when fortune threatens immediate collapse. In The Discourses, he emphasizes the role of institutions in providing long-term resilience against fortune's fluctuations. One focuses on individual virtue, the other on collective strength. Together, they offer a comprehensive vision, survival in the short term, endurance in the long term. We can see echoes of this framework in countless examples from history. Consider leaders who rose through audacity. Alexander the Great, Napoleon, or more recently, figures who seized political opportunities during upheaval. They embodied virtue, bending fortune to their will. But history also shows the limits of audacity when institutions are weak. Empires collapse with the death of a single leader, while republics with strong institutions endure for centuries. Machiavelli saw this clearly. Fortune may favor the bold, but without institutional foundations, boldness alone cannot secure lasting stability. His treatment of virtue and fortuna also speaks to the human condition beyond politics. Every life is shaped by forces we cannot control: accidents, illnesses, economic downturns, sudden opportunities. Fortune, in this sense, touches everyone. The question is how we respond. Do we resign ourselves to fate, or do we cultivate the qualities of virtue, resilience, adaptability, and the courage to act when opportunities arise? In this way, Machiavelli's insights extend from princes and republics to the choices each of us faces in navigating our own lives. Perhaps this is why his thought remains unsettling but compelling. He does not offer comfort, but he does offer clarity. He tells us that the world is uncertain, that fortune is unpredictable, that morality may not protect us from disaster. But he also tells us that we are not helpless. By cultivating boldness, foresight, and adaptability, we can resist fortune's blows and even turn her caprice to our advantage. It is a message at once sobering and empowering. Seen in this light, Machiavelli's philosophy is not a counsel of despair, but of responsibility. It demands that leaders, and indeed all of us, confront the world as it is, with its dangers and uncertainties, and act with the strength we can muster. Virtue may not guarantee success, but without it, failure is certain. Fortune may not be mastered, but with preparation and boldness, she can sometimes be guided. In the balance between these two forces, the unpredictability of fortune and the agency of human action, lies the enduring drama of politics and of life itself. Machiavelli captured that drama with a candor that still challenges us to this day. At the core of Machiavelli's political thought lies a view of human nature that is at once bleak and bracing. He does not write as if people are noble creatures guided primarily by reason or morality. Nor does he describe them as children of God who naturally incline toward goodness. Instead, he presents a portrait that is stripped of comforting illusions. People, he argues, are self-interested, fickle, and prone to betrayal when circumstances change. They may appear loyal in times of prosperity, but when hardship comes, their devotion often evaporates. For a leader, failing to recognize this reality is fatal. This was not a casual aside in his writings. It was a central conviction, repeated in different forms across The Prince and the Discourses. Human beings, he wrote, are ungrateful, fickle, liars and deceivers, fearful of danger and greedy for gain. This is not a flattering description, but it reflects what he believed he had observed time and again. In Florence, he saw citizens cheer for Savonarola one year and demand his execution the next. He saw alliances sealed with oaths and handshakes collapse overnight. He saw mercenaries switch sides for a higher payment. From these experiences, he concluded that trust, loyalty, and love are fragile bonds. A wise ruler does not depend on them. This perspective set him apart from many earlier traditions. Christian political thought emphasized the ruler's duty to care for his people as a shepherd tends his flock. Ancient writers, too, often spoke of the common good, imagining that citizens could be guided by honor and civic virtue. Machiavelli did not deny that such qualities exist, but he treated them as unreliable foundations for power. In his view, people are capable of loyalty and virtue, but only when it aligns with their interests. When survival, ambition, or fear come into play, self-interest prevails. One might object that this is too cynical, too dark a view of humanity, but Machiavelli would answer that it is not cynicism, but honesty. Better to prepare for betrayal than to be surprised by it. Better to assume people will act out of self-interest than to rely on their goodwill. A ruler who expects gratitude, he warned, will find himself abandoned when fortune turns. A ruler who understands the frailty of human loyalty will govern with prudence, ensuring obedience through fear, institutions, or necessity rather than love alone. Consider how this plays out in practical advice. Machiavelli tells rulers to avoid relying on promises. People break promises when keeping them becomes inconvenient or costly. Therefore, a ruler must be ready to break his own promises as well when necessity demands it. Hypocrisy, in this sense, is not a moral failure, but a survival skill. Similarly, he warns that generosity can breed expectation and resentment. A ruler who lavishes gifts may win temporary affection, but he will soon exhaust his resources, and when he can no longer give, the same people will turn on him. Far safer, Machiavelli argues, to be seen as careful with resources, even stingy, than to court love through generosity that cannot be sustained. His realism about human nature is also evident in his treatment of religion. Machiavelli recognized the power of religious belief to unite and inspire people, but he also saw how quickly devotion could shift and how often religious leaders manipulated faith for political ends. He did not reject religion outright. In fact, he admired how Rome used religion to strengthen civic unity. But he never confused devotion with loyalty. Religion was useful, but it could not be trusted as an enduring bond between rulers and the ruled. What is remarkable is how relevant these insights remain. In modern politics, leaders still discover the limits of public affection. A politician celebrated in times of prosperity may be abandoned in times of economic hardship. Promises made on campaign trails are easily forgotten once circumstances change. Companies that rely on customer loyalty find it evaporating when a competitor offers better prices or new conveniences. In every sphere, Machiavelli's warning holds. People are loyal until it no longer serves their interests. Yet there is nuance in his view. He did not claim that people are purely selfish or incapable of noble actions. Rather, he insisted that noble actions cannot be the foundation of politics because they are too rare and too fragile. Individuals may sacrifice for others, but masses rarely do so reliably. A state that depends on widespread altruism is doomed. A state that assumes self-interest and structures itself accordingly has a chance of survival. In this sense, Machiavelli's realism about human nature aligns with his broader emphasis on necessity. Politics, for him, is not about ideals but about what works. And what works must take account of how people actually behave, not how we wish they would. Leaders who ignore this reality court disaster. Leaders who embrace it, however uncomfortable, are better equipped to endure. This perspective also explains why he valued institutions. If people are fickle, then a state must create structures that channel their ambitions productively and constrain their potential for betrayal. Rome, in his eyes, succeeded not because its citizens were saints, but because its institutions forced them to balance each other. Ambition was not eliminated, but redirected into offices, assemblies, and competition that strengthened the republic. Florence, by contrast, too often relied on personalities and fragile loyalties. leaving it vulnerable to collapse. We might find Machiavelli's description of human beings unsettling, but we must admit its resonance. Who has not seen friendships falter under pressure, alliances dissolve when interests diverge, or loyalty evaporate when rewards dry up? His honesty forces us to confront the less flattering aspects of our nature. And while we may protest that people are capable of goodness, and indeed they are, his warning is that goodness cannot be the basis of political order. To build on such a foundation is to build on sand. In the end, Machiavelli's view of human nature is not a condemnation, but a challenge. If people are self-interested and fickle, then leaders must account for it. If loyalty is fragile, then institutions must secure stability. If appearances matter more than truth, then rulers must manage appearances carefully. Politics, in his vision, is the art of governing people as they are, not as we imagine them to be. It is this candor that has kept his name alive for centuries. He did not flatter us with illusions. He told us the truth as he saw it, however uncomfortable, that men are not reliably good, that they will betray when it suits them, that they will love when it is easy and abandon when it is hard. To govern in ignorance of this reality is folly. To govern with awareness of it is, in Machiavelli's eyes, the beginning of wisdom. Among all of Machiavelli's teachings, none is quoted more often than his claim that it is better for a ruler to be feared than loved. The phrase, repeated endlessly across centuries, has made him infamous as the philosopher of cruelty and tyranny. Yet to stop at this line alone is to miss the subtlety of his argument. Machiavelli did not glorify violence for its own sake. He did not counsel rulers to indulge in cruelty without measure. Rather, he offered a precise calculation. Love is fragile, fear is reliable, but cruelty, if used, must be measured carefully. For excess leads not to stability, but to hatred. And hatred, in his eyes, was the surest path to ruin. This perspective begins with his assessment of love. To Machiavelli, love is voluntary. It is freely given by people when they feel secure, when prosperity is abundant, or when leaders distribute favors. But, because it is voluntary, it can vanish the moment circumstances turn. A prince who relies on being loved by his people will find that love evaporates when taxes rise, when enemies advance, or when famine strikes. Affection is unreliable because it rests on choice, and choice changes when interests change. Fear, by contrast, binds more tightly. It is rooted in the instinct of self-preservation. People may abandon love when times are hard, but fear of punishment remains. A ruler who instills a reasonable fear of consequences ensures obedience even in adversity. For Machiavelli, this was not cruelty but prudence, an acknowledgement of human nature as it is, not as we wish it to be. Yet he drew an important distinction. Fear must never cross the line into hatred. Hatred provokes rebellion, conspiracies, and the kind of desperate opposition that can overthrow even a powerful ruler. To be feared is to command respect through discipline and consequence. To be hated is to awaken a passion so strong that people will risk everything to destroy you. A wise leader must know the difference. This distinction is where Machiavelli's treatment of cruelty becomes especially nuanced. He recognized that rulers sometimes must use violence. A new prince who seizes power may need to eliminate rivals or impose order through harsh measures. But cruelty, he argued, should be swift, decisive, and limited. He praised leaders who acted firmly at the outset and then refrained from constant bloodshed. Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli admired, offers an example. When Borgia took control of Romagna, the region was in disorder. He appointed a brutal lieutenant, Ramiro de Orco, to restore order with ruthless methods. Once order was established, Borgia had the lieutenant executed publicly, presenting himself as the bringer of justice. The cruelty was concentrated and followed by a gesture that won him the people's gratitude. To Machiavelli, this was cruelty, well used, harsh but effective, followed by stability. By contrast, cruelty that is prolonged, arbitrary, or self-indulgent breeds hatred. Leaders who torment their people unnecessarily, who impose suffering without purpose, or who waver between leniency and harshness, undermine their own stability. They create enemies where none need exist. Machiavelli warned that cruelty, if mismanaged, becomes self-destructive. It is not cruelty itself that ruins rulers, but cruelty without measure, cruelty that awakens hatred instead of fear. Here we see the pragmatism that sets Machiavelli apart from caricatures of him as a simple advocate of brutality. He did not endorse wanton violence. He endorsed violence as a tool to be used sparingly and strategically. His concern was always the preservation of the state. If cruelty secured order, it was justified. If cruelty provoked hatred, it was foolish. The test was not morality in the abstract, but effectiveness in practice. This marks a sharp departure from the traditions that preceded him. In Christian thought, cruelty was sin, condemned without qualification. In classical philosophy, rulers were often advised to cultivate mercy as a virtue. Machiavelli broke with both. He did not measure cruelty against moral standards, but against political outcomes. For him, the question was never, is this act good? But, will this act preserve power and stability, or will it lead to hatred and collapse? In this shift, he inaugurated a new way of thinking about politics, one grounded not in ideals, but in necessity. Modern readers may recoil from this cold calculation, but it has a certain honesty. History offers countless examples of leaders who lost their thrones because they were too lenient, too trusting, too eager to be loved. It also offers examples of rulers who secured stability through decisive, even ruthless, measures, yet avoided excess that would have turned subjects into enemies. Machiavelli forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths rather than hide from them behind moral platitudes. His reflections on cruelty also reveal his broader understanding of power as an art of balance. A ruler must weigh fear against love, discipline against leniency, cruelty against mercy. Too much of one or the other can destabilize the state. Politics, for Machiavelli, is not about rigid principles, but about judgment. The ability to discern when harshness is necessary and when restraint is wiser. This demand for judgment makes leadership both dangerous and deeply human. It is telling that his examples often come from Rome. He admired how Roman leaders used severity to secure order, but also built institutions to temper ambition. He admired figures who combined boldness with prudence, cruelty with justice. Rome, in his view, showed that political survival requires a willingness to act against conventional morality when necessary, but also the wisdom to avoid excess. The relevance of these ideas endures. In modern politics, leaders who appear too soft often invite challenges, while those who govern through excessive repression provoke revolts. In business, managers who rely solely on affection risk being ignored, while those who lead through fear alone breed resentment and turnover. The challenge is always balance. Enough fear to command respect, but not so much cruelty that it turns into hatred. What makes Machiavelli unsettling is not simply that he acknowledged the role of cruelty in politics. It is that he insisted we confront it as a reality we cannot wish away. Leaders may aspire to rule through love alone, but history, he argued, proves this aspiration fragile. Leaders who recognize the necessity of fear and who manage cruelty with prudence have a better chance of survival. Leaders who deny this reality often lose both love and power. In this light, his advice is less an endorsement of brutality than a warning against naivety. The world is not governed by ideals alone. It is governed by human nature, by fear and self-interest, by the fragile bonds of loyalty, and by the unpredictable turns of fortune. To navigate this world, leaders must be willing to act decisively, even harshly, while never forgetting the limits of cruelty and the danger of hatred. Machiavelli's reflections on fear and cruelty remain disturbing because they strip away illusions we prefer to keep. We want to believe that love is enough, that kindness will be repaid with loyalty, that cruelty is always punished. He reminds us that history tells another story, one in which fear often secures obedience, cruelty sometimes builds stability, and the difference between wise leadership and tyranny lies not in rejecting violence outright, but in knowing how, when, and to what extent it must be used. One of the most unsettling lessons Machiavelli offers is his insistence that, in politics, Appearances often matter more than reality. A ruler may be cruel, manipulative, or even cowardly, but if he appears merciful, honest, and courageous, he can still maintain power. By contrast, a ruler who genuinely embodies virtues but fails to project them will appear weak and risk being overthrown. In the harsh arena of politics, perception outweighs substance. This is a theme Machiavelli hammers home in The Prince. He does not advise rulers to abandon virtue entirely, nor does he deny that being virtuous can sometimes be useful. But he warns that leaders who insist on practicing virtues in all circumstances will often find themselves undone. The world is too dangerous, human beings too fickle, and fortune too unpredictable for morality to be applied rigidly. Instead, he counsels that rulers should cultivate the appearance of virtue because appearances are what people see, believe, and respond to. He lists the traditional virtues: mercy, honesty, generosity, faithfulness, and then argues that while they are admirable in theory, in practice they often work against survival. Too much mercy invites disorder. Too much honesty exposes weakness. Too much generosity drains the treasury. Too much faithfulness makes a ruler vulnerable to betrayal. And yet, he insists, rulers must seem to embody these very virtues. They must appear merciful, honest, generous, and faithful, even as necessity sometimes forces them to act in ways that contradict these appearances. This is not mere hypocrisy for its own sake. It is a recognition of how human perception operates. People judge not by what they cannot see, but by what they can. They cannot peer into a ruler's heart. They see only his actions, his gestures, his words. If those project virtue, they are reassured, even if the reality is different. Machiavelli knew well how much politics depends on symbols, ceremonies, and public images. In Florence, he had seen how parades, festivals, and speeches shaped the mood of the city. In Rome, he studied how consuls and emperors cloaked their authority in rituals that conveyed dignity and strength. Appearances, in this sense, are not illusions, but instruments of power. Consider again his admiration for Cesare Borgia. Borgia was ruthless, but he also staged spectacles of justice and mercy. By executing his brutal lieutenant after order was restored, he projected fairness even though the cruelty had been his own strategy. He appeared as a protector of the people, even while consolidating personal power. Machiavelli praised this not because it was morally admirable, but because it was politically effective. This emphasis on appearances sets him against much of the moral tradition that came before. Christian teaching emphasized sincerity, that rulers should not only act justly, but be just in their hearts. Classical philosophy, too, often held that authenticity mattered, that virtue was genuine only if it aligned inner character with outward action. He separated the inner from the outer, insisting that for politics, the outer is what counts. If survival depends on deceit, then deceit is not only acceptable but necessary, provided the mask of virtue is maintained. We may recoil from this bluntness, yet modern life confirms its resonance. In democratic politics, leaders are judged as much by their public image as by their policies. A carefully staged photograph, a well-timed speech, or a display of emotion on camera can sway public opinion more powerfully than legislation. In business, CEOs who project confidence can maintain investor trust even when their companies face difficulties. In personal life, too, appearances shape trust and reputation. Machiavelli's insight into the power of appearances is not limited to Renaissance courts. It touches the way human beings form judgments in every age. Still, his advice is not without caution. Appearances can sustain power, but only if carefully managed. If a ruler's deception is exposed, the backlash can be devastating. Hypocrisy must be concealed to be effective. The mask must never slip too far. This requires constant vigilance, discipline, and the ability to adapt. For Machiavelli, politics is a performance as much as a struggle, and leaders must master both roles: the actor who projects virtue and the strategist who calculates necessity. The unsettling brilliance of this argument lies in its refusal to let us cling to comforting illusions. We want to believe that authenticity triumphs, that sincerity is rewarded, that reality matters more than perception. Machiavelli shows us how often this is untrue. He reminds us that people see what is shown to them, not what is hidden, and that power belongs to those who understand and shape perception. It is a warning as much as a lesson: neglect appearances at your peril. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin once called Machiavelli's thought the most revolutionary break in Western morality. The break is visible here in his treatment of appearances. He does not measure politics by truth and authenticity, but by effectiveness and survival. In separating politics from morality, he forces us to ask whether the values that guide private life, honesty, sincerity, faithfulness, can ever fully apply to public life. If appearances are what sustain political order, then the demand for authenticity may be not only naive, but dangerous. For many readers, this is Machiavelli at his most disturbing. He admits openly what others practice in secret. He dares to say that rulers must lie, deceive, and manipulate appearances if they wish to endure. And yet, in doing so, he captures a reality that is difficult to deny. Who can look at history, or at contemporary politics, and fail to see how much appearances matter? Who can deny that survival often depends not on what is real, but on what is believed? Seen in this light, his argument is less a recommendation than a mirror. He shows us the world as it is, where appearances shape reality, and where survival often depends on deception. Whether we like what we see is another matter. But ignoring it, Machiavelli warns, is the luxury of the powerless. After the shock of his dismissal, the torture in prison, and the humiliation of exile, Machiavelli might have retreated into silence. Many disgraced officials of his time faded into obscurity, their ambitions broken by fortune's blows. But Nicole was not a man built for quiet resignation. Though barred from public office and under suspicion from the Medici, he refused to let his mind stagnate. In the years after 1513, we see a Machiavelli who was restless, searching, and surprisingly versatile. He wrote not only political treatises, but also plays, poems, and letters that reveal a different side of his character: playful, witty, and sharply observant. The letter to Francesco Vittori from December 1513 remains the most vivid snapshot of his life at Sant'Andrea. In it, Machiavelli describes his days of managing farmhands and dealing with petty quarrels among neighbors, his evenings in taverns where he played dice and traded jokes with millers and butchers, and his nights spent in dialogue with the ancients. This letter captures the full contrast of his exile. By day, a man humbled and provincial; by night, a thinker in communion with the great minds of Rome. It is a portrait both humorous and poignant. A man who had once shaped diplomacy at the highest level, now gambling for small stakes in a village tavern, yet still dreaming of politics with unquenched intensity. What is striking about Machiavelli in these years is his adaptability. Denied the stage of government, he found other outlets for his energy. He turned to literature. His comedy, La Mandragola, The Mandrake Root, became one of the most popular plays of the Renaissance. On the surface, it is a bawdy farce about lust and trickery, telling the story of a man who deceives a foolish husband to seduce his wife. But beneath the humor lies a sharp commentary on human folly, desire, and manipulation, themes not far from the lessons of The Prince. Audiences roared with laughter, but the wit was barbed. Machiavelli was showing that politics, seduction, and everyday life all obey similar laws: deception, persuasion, and the clever exploitation of weakness. He also wrote poetry, lighter works, and reflections on history. In every genre, the same qualities appear: sharp observation, irony, and a refusal to indulge in illusions. Even in comedy, his realism is present. He portrays people as they are: lustful, ambitious, easily duped, rather than as they ought to be. It is as if exile had freed him to explore human behavior from multiple angles, not only in the arena of princes and republics, but in households, taverns, and intimate affairs. We see not only the stern analyst of power, but also the man who craved company, laughter, and recognition. His letters are filled with self-deprecating humor, occasional bitterness, and flashes of hope that he might be restored to service. He jokes about his poverty, laments his obscurity, and flatters Vittori with playful banter. Yet always beneath the surface is the longing for politics. His heart remained tethered to Florence, to the city he could not serve but could never forget. Machiavelli was not content to be merely a scholar or philosopher in the abstract sense. He was, above all, a man of action, whose mind burned for practical engagement. Writing was not his true calling in the beginning, politics was. Yet, in exile, writing became his substitute for action. The arena where he could still contest ideas, shape understanding, and prove his worth. His treatises were not exercises in theory, but attempts to remain relevant, to re-enter the game of power through the force of words if not through office. It is telling that The Prince was dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici. Machiavelli hoped, perhaps naively, that the book would win him favor with the very family that had dismissed and tortured him. He wrote other works with similar hopes, offering advice, historical analysis, and reflections that might show his value. Again and again, we see him angling for a way back into service. He petitioned, he dedicated, he hinted at loyalty. Yet the Medici were cautious. They kept him at arm's length, never granting him the role he longed for. Still, exile was not barren. It was productive in ways Machiavelli may not have fully realized. Stripped of power, he turned inward and sharpened his insights. His writings from this period display a freedom of candor he might not have dared while in office. Removed from the constant demands of administration, he had the leisure to think deeply, to compare the lessons of history with his own bruising experiences. His works endure not because he held power, but because he lost it, and in loss found the voice that made him immortal. We must not forget the personal side of this exile. Machiavelli was a husband and father. His letters reveal financial worries, his struggle to provide for his family, and the sense of failure that came with his fall. These concerns make him relatable. He was not only a statesman and thinker, but also a man trying to keep his household afloat while his ambitions smoldered. His humor and wit and letters may mask deeper anxieties, but they also show resilience, a refusal to let defeat extinguish his vitality. In the plays and poetry of this period, we see a Machiavelli who laughed at human folly even as he suffered his own misfortunes. He turned personal frustration into satire, political failure into insight, and exile into creativity. The man who had once moved among kings and popes now entertained ordinary Florentines with comedies that skewered the pretensions of the powerful and the gullibility of the common. In this, too, we glimpse his genius. He could speak to all audiences, high and low, serious and playful, always with an eye for the hidden mechanics of human behavior. Exile, then, was not only a punishment, it was a crucible. It forced Machiavelli to reimagine himself, to channel his restless energy into words that would travel farther than his presence ever could. He remained restless, always yearning for politics, but his writings from these years reveal a resilience that turned humiliation into a new form of influence. When we picture him at Sant'Andrea, it is tempting to see only the broken official. But we should also see the man at his desk, writing with both bitterness and humor, crafting works that entertained his contemporaries and challenged future generations. His exile was not the end of his story, but the middle chapter of a life that, though denied direct power, still shaped the understanding of power for centuries to come. For all his wit and restless creativity in exile, Machiavelli never abandoned the hope of returning to political life. His mind remained fixed on Florence, on the world of diplomacy, councils, and negotiation that had once defined him. The Medici had stripped him of office and subjected him to torture, yet he continued to seek their favor, writing letters, dedicating works, and offering his insight in the hope of regaining a position. It was a paradox at the heart of his exile. The man who wrote with brutal clarity about power was himself entangled in the humiliating need to please those who had ruined him. This is one of the most revealing tensions in Machiavelli's life. We often imagine him as detached, cold, a theorist of manipulation, untroubled by pride. But the reality was more complicated. He was proud, immensely so. of his service to Florence, of his diplomatic skill, of his understanding of politics. And yet he was also desperate. His dismissal left him not only dishonored, but impoverished. He had a family to support, debts to manage, and a restless energy that could not be satisfied with farming or tavern gossip. His petitions to the Medici, then, were both personal and political, a bid for relevance and a plea for survival. The dedication of the prince to Lorenzo de' Medici was the boldest of these attempts. In it, Machiavelli presents his little book as a gift, the only thing he has left to offer. He frames himself as a man of low station, lacking wealth or power, but rich in knowledge gleaned from years of service and reflection. He offers Lorenzo a distillation of what he has learned about states and rulers, an honest manual for survival in the dangerous world of Italian politics. It is at once a statement of genius and a posture of humility. Here is the man who had been broken by fortune, presenting himself as useful, loyal, and willing to serve again. But Lorenzo never employed him. Whether he was offended by the frankness of the prince or simply mistrusted its author, the Medici patronage Machiavelli hoped for never came. The book circulated in manuscript, but it did not win him the redemption he sought. Instead, it secured his notoriety in ways he could not have predicted. Undeterred, Machiavelli continued to write in hopes of catching Medici attention. He composed The Art of War, 1521, a dialogue on military strategy that argued once more for citizen militias and criticized reliance on mercenaries. He dedicated it not to a Medici prince, but to a group of Florentine citizens, yet the work reflects his ongoing desire to demonstrate his practical value. He also wrote histories, including the Florentine Histories, commissioned eventually by Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, the future Pope Clement VII. Here, at last, was a measure of recognition, though still far less than Machiavelli had dreamed of. The letters from this period reveal the strain of his situation. In one, he describes his attempts to gain even minor appointments, only to be passed over. In another, he jokes bitterly about his obscurity, likening himself to a disused tool left to rust. Beneath the humor lies humiliation. This was a man who had once negotiated with kings and emperors, reduced now to begging for scraps of employment from the family that distrusted him. His sharp intellect could dissect the mechanics of power, but it could not overcome the realities of patronage and suspicion that governed Florence. The same Machiavelli who counseled princes to act decisively, to seize fortune by boldness, to avoid dependence on others, was himself dependent. He knew the rules of the game, but knowing them did not spare him from playing it badly. He could expose the illusions of politics in writing, yet he could not free himself from the humiliations of his own situation. The philosopher of power was, in his personal life, powerless. This dissonance complicates the common caricature of Machiavelli as a cynical manipulator. The real man was far less secure. He was ambitious, but vulnerable, brilliant, but needy. His petitions to the Medici remind us that he was not above flattery, that he was capable of compromise, that he felt the sting of exclusion as acutely as anyone might. His brilliance lay in analyzing the forces that governed human behavior, but he himself was still bound by them. And yet, even in humiliation, his genius shone through. His writings from this period did not merely beg for favor, they reshaped the intellectual landscape. The Prince, the Discourses, the Art of War, and the Florentine Histories all emerged from his exile and his restless bid for recognition. The Medici may not have granted him a prominent role, but history did. The works he produced in pursuit of their approval became the foundation of his legacy. Ironically, it was his exclusion from power that made him more powerful in the long run. Seen in this light, his petitions take on a tragic quality. Machiavelli the man wanted nothing more than to serve Florence again, to return to the councils and embassies that had defined his life. Machiavelli the thinker, however, was creating works that would endure far beyond the petty struggles of Medici politics. The tension between these two selves, the ambitious servant and the immortal writer, defines his middle years. We can sympathize with his plight. Who among us has not faced the frustration of being overlooked, of watching lesser talents advance while our own contributions go unrecognized. Who has not felt the sting of needing help from those we dislike or mistrust? Machiavelli's petitions to the Medici are not only historical documents, they are mirrors of human pride, humiliation, and resilience. In the end, the Medici never restored him to the positions he craved. He was occasionally employed for minor tasks, and his Florentine histories brought him some patronage, but he remained on the margins. The city that once relied on his skill never fully forgave his past. The power he sought never returned. But the works he produced in his pursuit of that power ensured that he would remain, not as a servant of Florence, but as a teacher to the world. In 1521, after years of disappointment and frustration, Machiavelli managed to publish the only book that appeared in print during his lifetime, The Art of War. On the surface, it was a treatise on military organization and strategy, written in the form of a dialogue between a veteran soldier and several Florentine citizens. But beneath its technical discussions of formations, weapons, and tactics, the book carried a larger message, one that reached to the heart of his political thought. For Machiavelli, the strength of any state rested ultimately on the strength of its military, and the strength of its military, in turn, depended not on mercenaries or hired swords, but on its own citizens, trained and ready to fight for their freedom. This was not a new theme for him. In The Prince and the Discourses, he had already denounced the reliance on mercenaries that plagued the Italian city-states. He had seen too many battles lost because condottieri, professional captains of fortune, abandoned the field when the risks outweighed the rewards. Mercenaries, he argued, are loyal only to money, and when money fails or a higher bidder appears, their loyalty dissolves. They bring danger rather than security. A state that relies on them is like a house built on sand. By contrast, Machiavelli praised the Roman Republic for building its power on citizen armies. Rome's legions were composed of men who had a direct stake in the survival of the Republic. They fought not only for pay, but for their land, their families, their civic honor. Military discipline was inseparable from civic virtue. To fight for Rome was to be a Roman. This, for Machiavelli, was the true foundation of political strength. The Art of War is full of practical detail, discussions of infantry formations, the advantages of certain weapons, the role of fortifications. But its deeper argument is political. A free state must defend itself with the arms of its own citizens. To outsource defense is to outsource liberty itself. Only a citizen militia, trained and disciplined, can safeguard freedom. This conviction reflects his broader realism about human nature. Just as he distrusted loyalty based on love alone, he distrusted military power based on hired service. Both, in his view, are fragile bonds that dissolve under pressure. Fear secures more than love, and citizen militias secure more than mercenaries. In both politics and war, the same principle applies. Stability depends on necessity and self-interest, not on fragile sentiments or purchased promises. It is worth pausing to consider how radical this argument was in Renaissance Italy. The reliance on mercenary armies had become deeply entrenched. Wealthy city-states preferred to hire professionals rather than arm their citizens, partly out of fear that an armed populace might turn against them. Mercenaries seemed safer in the short term, even if unreliable in the long term. Machiavelli, by contrast, urged Florentines to embrace the risk of arming their own people, arguing that true freedom could not exist without it. A republic unwilling to trust its citizens with arms, he warned, was a republic already in decay. In this, we see Machiavelli's republican spirit shining clearly. He was not simply offering tactical advice. He was articulating a philosophy of civic responsibility. A citizen who is willing to fight for his state is also a citizen more invested in its survival, its laws, and its liberty. Military service, in this sense, was part of the fabric of civic life. Rome's greatness, in his telling, was not only its armies but its culture of discipline and participation. The decline of Rome, likewise, came when luxury and corruption undermined this spirit of citizen service. Modern readers may be surprised to find Machiavelli writing with such detail about military matters. Yet for him, the connection was obvious. Politics and war are inseparable. A ruler who ignores military strength, he wrote, is like a man who builds a palace without foundations. The splendor may impress, but the first storm will bring it down. Politics without military strength is illusion, and military strength without civic participation is fragile. The influence of the art of war extended beyond Florence. Later thinkers and leaders admired its clarity about the relationship between military power and political freedom. The American founders, who had read the Discourses, also absorbed his warnings about standing armies and the importance of citizen militias. The idea that liberty requires citizens willing to defend it resonates across centuries, even if the form of armies has changed. At the same time, Machiavelli was not naive. He knew that citizen militias required discipline and training, not mere enthusiasm. Untrained crowds with weapons were no more reliable than mercenaries. The strength of Rome's legions lay not only in their civic identity, but in their strict discipline, their organization, their ability to endure hardship. Machiavelli's art of war therefore emphasized drill, structure, and leadership. Liberty was not sustained by passion alone, but by discipline harnessed to civic purpose. Seen in the larger arc of his thought, the art of war complements The Prince and the Discourses. The Prince reveals how individual rulers must act in moments of crisis. The Discourses explores the institutions that sustain a republic over time. The art of war adds a third pillar, the military foundations that make both survival and endurance possible. Without military strength, princes and republics alike are at the mercy of fortune. With it, they have a chance to shape their own destiny. What makes this work especially poignant is that it reflects Machiavelli's enduring hope of being useful again. He wrote it not as an abstract treatise, but as a manual that might convince the Medici of his practical value. By offering detailed advice on how Florence might strengthen itself, he was once more seeking favor. Yet, as with the Prince, the personal goal failed, even as the intellectual achievement endured. There is, then, a double legacy in the art of war. On the one hand, it is a record of Machiavelli's desperation, his bid to re-enter political service by showing his expertise. On the other hand, it is a lasting statement of principle, that freedom and security rest on citizens who are willing to fight for their state, that mercenaries bring ruin, and that politics cannot be separated from military strength. For modern readers, the details of pikes, arquebuses, and battle formations may seem distant, but the core lesson remains close to home. A society that outsources its defense, that expects freedom without sacrifice, that prefers comfort to discipline, is a society that risks decay. Machiavelli's warning is stark. Liberty survives only when citizens are prepared to bear its burdens, not merely enjoy its fruits. In the early 1520s, Niccolò Machiavelli received what must have felt like a small redemption, a commission from Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, the future Pope Clement VII, to write an official history of Florence. It was not the political office he craved, nor the full restoration of trust he longed for, but it was recognition. After years of rejection and humiliation, the Medici family, who had once imprisoned and tortured him, now employed him to tell the story of his own city. The task was both an honor and a test. The Florentine Histories, completed in 1525, is not a dry chronicle of dates and events. It is a narrative infused with Machiavelli's characteristic eye for conflict, ambition, and the mechanics of power. His subject was Florence, but his theme was universal, politics as the ceaseless struggle between factions, classes, and ambitions. If The Prince showed rulers how to act, and the Discourses revealed how republics endure, the Histories illustrated how cities rise and fall through conflict. He begins not with Florence alone, but with the broader sweep of Italy, setting the stage for the city's emergence. He then traces Florence's story through centuries of turmoil, the clashes between nobles and commoners, the constant rebalancing of power, the rise and fall of regimes. Again and again, he highlights the destructive role of factionalism. Florentine history, in his telling, is a pattern of internal strife. Powerful families feuding, guilds struggling for influence, republican ideals clashing with aristocratic ambitions. It is a city defined by brilliance and beauty, yet constantly undermined by division. The Medici who commissioned the work may have hoped for a flattering account, and indeed, Machiavelli was careful. He did not directly condemn the family. He dedicated the work to Pope Clement VII, presenting himself as a loyal servant. But beneath the surface, his realism persisted. He described Florence not as a harmonious community, but as a battlefield of competing interests. He acknowledged the brilliance of its culture, its artists, its commerce, its civic energy. But he refused to romanticize its politics. Conflict was not an aberration, but the essence of its story. This approach reflects Machiavelli's larger philosophy of history. For him, history is not guided by providence or morality, but by necessity, ambition, and the unpredictable play of fortune. He looked to the past not for moral lessons, but for patterns. Rome's rise, Florence's struggles, the endless rivalries of Italian states, all revealed the same dynamics of power. Human nature does not change, and therefore, history repeats its rhythms. Studying history, for Machiavelli, was not about reverence for the past, but about equipping oneself to navigate the present. In the Florentine histories, one senses both pride and bitterness. Pride in the richness of Florence's story, in its contributions to art, commerce, and republican life. Bitterness in the recognition that the city had squandered so much potential through division. Again and again, he shows how internal discord weakened Florence against external threats. The city that produced Dante, Giotto, and Brunelleschi also produced endless conspiracies, exiles, and coups. Its brilliance was matched only by its instability. Machiavelli's emphasis on conflict was not accidental. In the Discourses, he had argued that the clash between social classes in Rome, far from being destructive, had strengthened the Republic by creating checks and balances. But in Florence, the same energy produced only instability. Why the difference? For Machiavelli, the answer lay in institutions. Rome had harnessed conflict through laws and offices that gave both patricians and plebeians a stake in the system. Florence never achieved this balance. Its institutions were too fragile, its factions too ruthless, its leaders too self-serving. The lesson was clear: conflict is inevitable, but whether it strengthens or destroys depends on how institutions channel it. This insight gives the Florentine histories a dual purpose. On the surface, it is a narrative of Florence's past. Beneath the surface, it is a meditation on political design. Machiavelli was showing his Medici patrons, and any reader, that the city's fate was not the product of individual sins alone, but of structural weakness. Without durable institutions, even the most brilliant city would be doomed to turmoil. It was a subtle way of reminding the Medici that their power, too, was fragile without institutional support. The style of the histories is different from the sharp, concise prose of the prince. It is broader, more expansive, more narrative. But the same skeptical eye shines through. Where others might have written panegyrics to Florence's greatness, Machiavelli wrote a story of its divisions. Where others might have praised noble families, he exposed their ambitions. Where others might have cloaked events in providence, he analyzed them in terms of necessity. The work is less famous than his other writings, but it offers perhaps the clearest picture of how he thought history should be studied, as a record of human struggles, not moral tales. For modern readers, the Florentine histories may feel strikingly contemporary. Its pages are filled with the kinds of conflicts that still shape societies: elites versus commoners, tradition versus reform, private ambition versus the public good. Its message is that politics is never static, that division is constant, and that survival depends not on suppressing conflict, but on channeling it. In this sense, Machiavelli's Florence is not so far from our own societies, with their competing interests and fragile institutions. We should also remember the personal dimension. By accepting the commission, Machiavelli was swallowing pride. He had once been branded an enemy of the Medici, yet here he was, writing under their patronage. The man who had been tortured by their regime now produced a history dedicated to their leading figure. Was this hypocrisy, or was it necessity? The same necessity he counseled rulers to embrace. Perhaps both. Like his princes, Machiavelli knew the importance of appearances. By presenting himself as a loyal servant, he ensured his survival. Yet within the pages of his history, his realism spoke more freely than his dedications. The Florentine histories did not restore him fully to political life, but it did re-establish him as a thinker of significance. It showed that he was not merely a pamphleteer of scandalous advice, but a serious historian capable of chronicling the destiny of his city. It gave him a place, however modest, in the Medici orbit. And it added another dimension to his legacy: Machiavelli, the historian, not only the theorist of power. In the end, the Florentine histories reflects the paradox of Machiavelli's career. He wanted to serve Florence directly, to shape events as a diplomat and official. Instead, he served it indirectly, by interpreting its past and extracting lessons for its future. He longed for action, but left his mark through words. And in those words, he preserved for future generations not a flattering portrait of Florence, but an honest one. A city of brilliance and strife, of art and ambition, of promise and peril. As the 1520s wore on, Niccolò Machiavelli entered the final chapter of his life. He was in his 50s, no longer young by the standards of Renaissance Italy, and the years of exile had taken their toll. Though he had found outlets in writing and occasional minor commissions, the great return to political power that he longed for never came. Florence remained under Medici control, and while they tolerated him and even employed him for certain tasks, they never restored him to the central role he believed he deserved. For a man whose life had been defined by political engagement, this was a slow, grinding disappointment. Financial difficulties compounded his frustrations. He was never wealthy, and the loss of steady income from public service left him struggling to support his household. Letters from these years reveal a man constantly worried about money, trying to secure payment for his works, appealing for small posts, and managing debts. The sharp humor that colored his earlier correspondence now often carried a note of weariness. Behind the jokes and banter lay a man aware of his declining fortunes. And yet, Machiavelli did not collapse into bitterness. His vitality persisted, even if tinged with resignation. He continued to write, to observe, to reflect. He participated in literary circles in Florence, where his comedies were staged and his wit was appreciated. Friends remembered him as lively, talkative, full of stories and jokes. In these moments, one sees the resilience of a man who, though denied political greatness, refused to be silenced. He remained, to the end, a presence, restless, sharp, and alive to the ironies of the world around him. Still, the sense of decline was undeniable. By the mid-1520s, the Medici had consolidated their power, and Florence was far from the republican spirit that Machiavelli had once celebrated. His dream of serving a free republic, strengthened by citizen armies and wise institutions, seemed remote. Machiavelli must have felt the futility of his vision. He had devoted his thought to preserving liberty and stability, but the city he loved seemed increasingly beyond saving. This awareness of decline extended to his own body. He was aging, and though not yet an old man, he carried the weight of fatigue. His earlier energy, which had propelled him through diplomatic missions and nights of study, was now tempered by the aches and frailties of middle age. In Renaissance terms, where life expectancy was lower and illness constant, his awareness of mortality would have been acute. Friends and colleagues died around him. Wars and plague swept through Italy. He knew his time was limited. What makes this period poignant is the contrast between his intellectual vitality and his political marginalization. His mind remained sharp, his ideas as provocative as ever, yet the world no longer gave him the stage he craved. He was a thinker whose insights reached across centuries, but in his own day he was a sidelined figure, known but not trusted, admired but not embraced. It is a reminder that genius is not always recognized in its own time, that history often saves for later what contemporaries neglect. And yet, Machiavelli did taste a measure of recognition. His Florentine histories brought him some esteem, and his comedies delighted audiences. He was not forgotten or entirely obscure, but he knew the difference between literary praise and political power. The stage of letters was not the stage of government, and he longed for the latter. Even as he aged, he still angled for positions, still wrote to patrons, still hoped for some restoration. Hope dies slowly, even in the face of repeated disappointment. In these later years, we glimpse a Machiavelli who is both humbled and defiant, humbled by the reality that his career as a statesman was over, defiant in that he continued to write truths that others avoided. He never softened his realism to suit convention, never retreated into piety or false comfort. His view of human nature, politics, and fortune remained bracingly clear-eyed. If anything, exile and age had only sharpened his commitment to honesty. He had lived too much, suffered too much, and seen too much to flatter illusions. There is something profoundly relatable here. Many in midlife or later years know the sting of unfulfilled ambition, the frustration of watching opportunities pass, the awareness that time is running out to achieve what one once dreamed. He was a man who knew he had the talent for greatness, but lacked the fortune to realize it. His legacy would be secured by his writings, but he himself longed for action. He wanted to shape events, not merely interpret them. That gap between desire and reality defined his decline. And yet, it was precisely this gap that gave his writings their edge. His exile and marginalization forced him into the role of observer, giving him the distance to analyze politics with brutal clarity. His sense of disappointment sharpened his insights into the role of fortune, the limits of human agency, and the fragility of power. He may have lost the game in his own time, but by writing about it, he ensured that his lessons would guide players for centuries to come. By the late 1520s, Machiavelli was a man aware of his own mortality. He had achieved much as a writer but little as a politician. He had influenced some circles but remained distrusted by the ruling family. His life was a story of brilliance frustrated by circumstance. And yet, in that story lies a deeper truth, that greatness is not always measured by office or honor, but by the clarity of one's vision. Machiavelli, denied the power he sought, gave the world something greater, an unflinching account of how power truly works. If there is a single theme that runs through all of Machiavelli's writings, it is the ceaseless tension between human effort and the forces beyond our control. He lived in an Italy torn apart by invasions, betrayals, and sudden reversals of fortune. He himself had risen in Florence's service, only to be cast down by a change in regime. He saw allies crumble, enemies triumph, and entire states collapse overnight. For him, no philosophy of politics could ignore the role of chance. And so he gave it a name that carried weight in both classical and Renaissance thought, Fortuna. Fortuna was not simply luck in the modern sense. It was the unpredictable, uncontrollable element of life. The shifting tides of war, the sudden death of a ruler, the outbreak of plague, the betrayal of a supposed friend. In ancient Rome, fortune was personified as a goddess, often blindfolded, turning her wheel without regard for human merit. Machiavelli inherited this image but made it harsher. He saw fortune not as a gentle goddess, but as a powerful, capricious force that could destroy the plans of even the wisest rulers. And yet, Machiavelli did not counsel resignation. He paired fortuna with another concept, virtù. This word does not mean virtue in the moral sense, kindness, justice, or piety, but something closer to strength, boldness, ingenuity, and the ability to bend circumstances to one's will. Virtue is the quality of the leader who acts decisively, who adapts to changing times, who seizes opportunities when they appear. It is the energy that confronts the chaos of fortune and wrestles from it some measure of control. He often illustrated the relationship between the two with vivid metaphors. In one of his most notorious passages, he compared fortune to a woman who must be mastered through boldness, for she favors the audacious over the cautious. The image is jarring to modern ears, but its meaning is clear. Fortune does not reward timidity. Those who wait passively for conditions to align are swept away. Those who act boldly, even recklessly, are more likely to bend events to their advantage. Another metaphor he employed was that of rivers. Fortune, he wrote, is like a raging river that floods and destroys everything in its path when unprepared, but whose force can be channeled and restrained if humans build dikes and dams. No one can stop the river from swelling, but foresight and planning can mitigate its destruction. In the same way, human beings cannot control fortune completely, but with virtue, they can prepare, adapt, and seize the chances that fortune presents. This balance between fortuna and virtue reveals the realism at the heart of Machiavelli's thought. He rejected both extremes, the belief that fate rules everything and human effort is meaningless, and the belief that humans can master events entirely by will. Instead, he insisted on a middle path. Fortune controls half of our lives, he argued, but the other half remains in our power. It is enough to demand courage, prudence, and boldness, but not enough to grant certainty. Machiavelli's own life illustrates the lesson. His rise in Florentine service owed much to fortune. The expulsion of the Medici had opened a place for him. His fall, likewise, owed much to fortune. Their return closed the door again. But within those shifting circumstances, his virtue was evident. His energy, his diplomacy, his writings, his relentless attempt to make himself useful. He could not control fortune, but he never ceased to exercise his own agency within its limits. This interplay between chance and effort resonates far beyond Renaissance politics. In our own lives, we know the truth of it. A sudden illness, an economic downturn, a stroke of luck. These can alter a life's course in ways no amount of planning could foresee. And yet, within those circumstances, we make choices. Some freeze in adversity, others adapt and act. Some squander opportunities, others seize them. Machiavelli's categories of Fortuna and Virtue capture this eternal drama. What makes his treatment compelling is its refusal of illusions. He did not promise that the virtuous in the moral sense would be rewarded, nor that hard work alone guaranteed success. He knew too well that fortune can destroy the righteous and favor the corrupt, but he also knew that passivity was the surest path to ruin. If fortune is half of life, then the other half demands human effort, boldness, skill, and the readiness to act when the moment comes. In this, his teaching is both harsh and empowering. Harsh, because it denies the comforting belief that justice or providence ensures good outcomes. Empowering, because it insists that even in the face of chaos, human agency matters. We may not control the storm, but we can set our sails. We may not command fortune, but we can prepare for her blows and seize her gifts. The concepts of Fortuna and Virtùe also explain why Machiavelli praised figures like Cesare Borgia, despite their ruthlessness. Borgia exemplified virtue in his boldness, his ability to adapt, his willingness to act decisively. Fortune eventually turned against him when his father, Pope Alexander VI, died, but until then he had bent fortune to his will through audacity. For Machiavelli, this was the model, not goodness in the moral sense, but effectiveness in the political sense. There is a tragic note in this philosophy. Even the boldest can be crushed by fortune. Even the most skillful cannot foresee every turn. Machiavelli himself was proof of this. He possessed virtue in abundance, yet fortune placed him in a time and place where his talents could not prevail. His writings survive as monuments to his insight, but his life was marked by frustration. The lesson is sobering. Virtue can increase our chances, but it cannot guarantee victory. And yet, his insistence on action carries a timeless resonance. He urges us to face life not with passivity, but with boldness, not with illusions, but with clarity. Fortune will always be capricious, but our response need not be. In politics, in business, in personal life, the same principle applies. Fortune presents opportunities and dangers, and virtue is the courage to act in the face of both. For Machiavelli, the interplay of fortune and human agency was not just a theory, but the very essence of political life. Leaders succeed or fail not by adhering rigidly to moral codes, but by reading the times, adapting to circumstances, and seizing the moments that fortune presents. The world, unpredictable and often unjust, demands no less. Few themes in Machiavelli's writings have provoked as much controversy as his treatment of religion. In an age when Christianity saturated every corner of European life, shaping laws, morality, and the rhythms of daily existence, he approached the subject with the same dispassionate realism he brought to politics and war. He did not deny religion's importance. On the contrary, he saw it as essential. But he stripped it of its sacred aura, treating it not as a divine truth, but as a human institution, a tool that could strengthen or weaken a state depending on how it was used. To understand this stance, we must remember his admiration for ancient Rome. Again and again, in the Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli praises the Roman Republic not only for its armies and laws, but for its civic religion. Roman leaders, he argued, understood the political utility of religion. Public rituals, auguries, and sacred ceremonies gave citizens a sense of unity, discipline, and purpose. Religion reinforced obedience and sacrifice, binding individuals to the collective. It was less about divine truth than about civic cohesion. In one striking passage, Machiavelli notes how Roman generals used omens to inspire courage or to delay battles until conditions were favorable. Whether the omens were genuine mattered less than their effect on the soldiers. Religion was a tool of morale and order, shaping human behavior by appealing to fear, reverence, and tradition. For Machiavelli, this was the model, religion as an instrument of statecraft. Christianity, by contrast, he judged far less favorably. He believed that Christianity, at least as it was practiced in his time, encouraged humility, meekness, and a focus on the afterlife, virtues that might serve the soul, but weakened the civic spirit. Whereas Roman religion promoted courage, discipline, and worldly achievement, Christianity promoted withdrawal from the world. Machiavelli lamented that this had made modern Italians less vigorous than their ancient counterparts. Where Rome had produced citizens ready to die for their republic, the Christianity of his day produced subjects more concerned with eternal salvation than with earthly freedom. It is important to see the nuance here. Machiavelli was not an atheist in the modern sense. Atheism was scarcely a category in his time. He did not deny God's existence or mock faith outright. But he shifted the frame of discussion. Instead of asking whether religion was true, he asked whether it was useful. And in asking that question, he redefined the role of religion in political thought. This utilitarian approach scandalized later readers. To many, it seemed irreligious, even blasphemous. The very act of treating religion as a tool of power rather than a divine mandate felt like sacrilege. Yet Machiavelli's frankness was of a piece with his entire philosophy. Just as he stripped morality out of politics, so too did he strip sanctity out of religion, reducing both to their practical functions. For him, what mattered was not doctrine but effect. A religion that unified citizens and strengthened civic virtue was good. A religion that weakened civic spirit was harmful. We can see the political dimension of this most clearly in his analysis of Italy's weakness. He argued that the division of the peninsula, torn between papal authority and secular rulers, had left it vulnerable to foreign invasions. The Church, instead of unifying Italy, had often sown discord. Far from being a source of strength, the papacy had been a source of fragmentation. In this sense, Machiavelli saw Christianity not only as spiritually weakening, but politically corrosive. Yet he was too astute to deny religion's enduring power. He recognized that belief cannot be uprooted simply because it is inconvenient. People are deeply shaped by faith, and rulers must account for this. The wise leader, then, does not seek to abolish religion, but to harness it. He encourages ceremonies, honors traditions, and uses the authority of religion to reinforce law and order. Even a ruler who privately doubts the truth of religious claims should publicly uphold them for the sake of social stability. Here again, appearances outweigh inner conviction. This dual perspective, critical of Christianity's weakening tendencies, yet insistent on the necessity of religion as a political force, reveals Machiavelli's realism. He was not writing theology. He was writing about the management of human beings. Religion, like fear, like law, like military discipline, was one of the levers by which people could be bound together and guided. To treat it otherwise, to view it only as a matter of personal conscience, was, in his eyes, to miss its political importance. For modern readers, this analysis feels uncannily familiar. We live in societies where religion is both deeply personal and politically potent. Leaders still invoke faith to unify, to inspire, to justify policy. Skeptics still worry about the political uses of belief. The tension between religion as sacred truth and religion as civic instrument remains unresolved. Machiavelli forces us to confront it without illusions. His treatment of religion also speaks to a broader theme in his philosophy: the gap between what we wish the world to be and what it actually is. We may wish that religion were purely a matter of divine truth, untouched by politics, but history shows otherwise. From Rome to Florence to our own day, religion has always shaped power, bound communities, and been used, wisely or cynically, by rulers. Machiavelli simply had the candor to say it. That candor is what earned him a reputation for impiety. Critics branded him a teacher of evil, a corrupter of morals, a man who placed expediency above truth. Yet to read him carefully is to see not contempt but clarity. He did not mock faith, he analyzed it. He did not dismiss religion, he insisted on its importance. What made him unsettling was his refusal to veil that importance in pious language. He told rulers not to be saints but to be effective. And in religion, as in politics, effectiveness was measured not by purity of doctrine but by stability of the state. In the end, Machiavelli's reflections on religion capture his larger legacy. He was not a destroyer of belief, but a realist who asked hard questions. What holds societies together? What inspires people to obey laws, fight for their country, sacrifice their lives? Religion, he saw, was one answer. Not the only one, but a powerful one. Whether we like his conclusions or not, we cannot ignore the truth behind them. Human beings live not only by reason, but by symbols, rituals, and beliefs. To govern without understanding this is to court failure. If there is a thread that binds together Machiavelli's analysis of history, it is his obsession with corruption and decay. He lived in a world where the greatness of states was matched by their fragility, where powerful republics collapsed into faction, and where ambitious rulers were undone by indulgence or weakness. For him, corruption was not simply moral vice, it was the political disease that gnawed at the foundations of every society. To understand politics, one had to understand not only how states are built, but how they rot. In the Discourses on Livy, he reflects on why Rome thrived for centuries, while Florence stumbled again and again. The difference, he argued, lay in their ability, or inability, to renew themselves. Rome's genius was not only in conquest, but in institutional design. Its balance between patricians and plebeians, its rotation of offices, and its acceptance of internal conflict created a system where civic energy could be redirected rather than suppressed. Florence, by contrast, never found this balance. Its factions consumed it from within, leaving it vulnerable to foreign domination. For Machiavelli, corruption begins when citizens lose their sense of responsibility to the common good. In a healthy republic, citizens are vigilant, engaged, and willing to sacrifice for the state. In a corrupt one, private interest overrides public duty. Wealth breeds luxury, luxury breeds softness, and softness breeds decay. Laws lose their force, leaders lose their discipline, and citizens become more interested in personal gain than collective strength. Once this rot sets in, the republic is doomed, unless it can be renewed. Renewal, in his view, rarely comes peacefully. Corrupt societies do not reform themselves willingly because the powerful who benefit from corruption resist change. Renewal requires crisis, sometimes even violence. In Rome, renewal often came through conflict, the creation of the tribunes, the reforms of great leaders, even the occasional dictatorship used to restore order. Florence, by contrast, saw its conflicts erupt in destructive ways, conspiracies, exiles, vendettas, that weakened rather than renewed the city. This is one of Machiavelli's most unsettling lessons. He does not present corruption as an avoidable flaw, but as an inevitable tendency. All states, he believed, carry within them the seeds of decline. Prosperity brings comfort, comfort weakens discipline, weakness invites collapse. The cycle is inexorable. But no design lasts forever. Even Rome, with all its strength, eventually succumbed. The harshness of this insight is balanced by its realism. Machiavelli refused to flatter us with the belief that societies naturally progress, or that human beings grow ever more virtuous. He insisted on the opposite, that human beings are prone to selfishness, that prosperity breeds decay, and that vigilance is always temporary. If there is a lesson here, it is one of humility. No society, however brilliant, is exempt. Florence was not, Rome was not, and we are not. Yet his reflections are not purely pessimistic. He believed that corruption could, at least for a time, be resisted. Laws, institutions, and, above all, citizen participation could strengthen a state against decay. He admired the Roman Republic precisely because it recognized human weakness and built structures to manage it. Rome did not pretend that citizens would always be virtuous. It forced them to be, through offices, obligations, and discipline. A society that expects virtue without structures to sustain it, he argued, is naive. A society that designs institutions to harness ambition may endure. This is why Machiavelli placed such importance on conflict. Conflict, properly channeled, was a source of renewal. The clash between patricians and plebeians in Rome, though dangerous, produced reforms that kept the republic vibrant. In Florence, the same energy turned into destructive feuds because the city lacked institutions to contain it. Conflict is inevitable. The question is whether it strengthens or destroys. That depends on the wisdom of a society's design. For modern readers, Machiavelli's theory of corruption carries a haunting relevance. We live in societies that are prosperous, comfortable, and often complacent. We enjoy freedoms won by earlier generations, but we also risk losing the civic vigilance that sustains them. His warning is clear: when citizens retreat into private comfort, when wealth becomes an end in itself, when public duty fades, corruption takes root. The decline may be slow, but it is inexorable unless renewal occurs. This is not merely a political diagnosis, but a human one. Machiavelli's understanding of corruption reflects his view of human nature, that people are self-interested, driven by desire, and prone to forget the common good when times are easy. The task of politics is not to deny this nature, but to shape it, to design systems where even self-interest contributes to public strength. Without such systems, corruption overwhelms. We can see in his own Florence the embodiment of his theory. The city was rich, brilliant, and creative, but also fractured, indulgent, and short-sighted. Its citizens produced wonders of art and commerce, yet failed to sustain a stable republic. Its wealth bred division, its politics bred mistrust, and its decline invited foreign domination. Machiavelli loved Florence, but he diagnosed its disease with merciless clarity. There is a somber wisdom in this view. It strips away the comforting idea that progress is inevitable, that once gained, liberty endures forever. Instead, it reminds us that every generation must renew its institutions, reawaken its civic spirit, and guard against corruption. To fail is to invite decline. For Machiavelli, this was not cynicism but realism, the hard truth of human affairs. And so, his reflections on corruption deepen our understanding of his entire philosophy. He was not only the teacher of princes, but the physician of republics, diagnosing the diseases that afflict them and prescribing harsh remedies. His medicine was bitter, but it was meant to save. To ignore corruption, he warned, is to pretend health while the body decays. To confront it honestly is the first step to renewal. Among Machiavelli's many metaphors, none is more memorable than his advice that a ruler must learn to be both a fox and a lion. The phrase captures in a few words the essence of his philosophy of leadership. Power cannot be sustained by strength alone, nor by cunning alone. To endure in the world of shifting alliances, treacherous enemies, and uncertain fortune, a ruler must combine the brute force of the lion with the sly intelligence of the fox. One without the other is inadequate. Together, they form the complete arsenal of political survival. The lion represents strength, force, and open confrontation. A lion is feared for its power, its ability to defend itself, and its willingness to crush opposition. Leaders who embody the lion command, respect, and deter threats. But the lion also has weaknesses. A lion can be trapped or outmaneuvered. Raw strength cannot detect hidden plots or avoid subtle dangers. A ruler who relies only on force may be formidable, but also predictable, vulnerable to cunning adversaries. The fox, by contrast, represents cunning, deception, and adaptability. A fox knows how to detect traps, how to maneuver through danger, and how to manipulate appearances. Leaders who embody the fox can avoid pitfalls, outwit rivals, and use trickery to gain advantage. But the fox too has weaknesses. A fox cannot fight off wolves. Cunning alone cannot overcome sheer force. A ruler who relies only on deceit may avoid defeat for a time, but cannot command lasting authority. For Machiavelli, the lesson was clear: successful leaders must master both roles. They must be lions when strength is required, crushing open threats decisively. But they must also be foxes when cunning is required, deceiving enemies, disguising intentions, and manipulating appearances. The greatest rulers are those who know when to be which, shifting between the two as circumstances demand. This dual image shatters the illusion that leadership can rest on a single quality, that one can rule by force alone or by intelligence alone. Machiavelli insists on the complexity of power. Human affairs are too unpredictable, too treacherous for simplicity. Leaders who cling to one method are doomed. Those who adapt, who combine strength with cunning, stand the best chance of survival. What makes this metaphor so enduring is that it extends far beyond Renaissance politics. We see the fox and the lion in modern life as well. In business, a successful executive must sometimes act with the force of the lion, making hard decisions, cutting losses, imposing discipline. But the same executive must also act with the cunning of the fox, reading competitors, negotiating deals, presenting one face to the public while pursuing another in private. In parenting, too, one might see the balance: the lion's firmness in setting boundaries, the fox's subtlety in guiding behavior. The metaphor speaks to any form of leadership where survival and influence are at stake. Machiavelli's image also reflects his deeper view of human nature. People are not purely rational or purely moral. They deceive, betray, and pursue their own interests. To govern them effectively, one cannot rely solely on honesty or solely on force. One must understand both sides of human behavior, the openness of confrontation and the secrecy of deception, and be prepared to respond in kind. Leaders who refuse to deceive, he warned, will always fall victim to those who do. Leaders who refuse to use force will always be crushed by those who will. This advice disturbed his readers because it broke with the tradition of presenting rulers as paragons of virtue. The mirror for princes literature of the Middle Ages and Renaissance typically urged rulers to be just, merciful, and pious. Machiavelli shattered this convention. He told rulers that deception is not only acceptable but necessary, that cruelty is sometimes required, that appearances matter more than sincerity. To be only a lion or only a fox is to fail. To be both is to rule. There is, however, a nuance worth noticing. Machiavelli did not suggest that rulers announce their cunning and ruthlessness. Quite the opposite. He advised them to appear virtuous, to cultivate reputations for mercy, honesty, and faithfulness, while using deception and force when needed. The fox operates best under cover of the lamb's clothing. The lion, too, must know when to conceal its claws. Appearance and reality diverge, and the wise ruler manages both. This duality reveals Machiavelli's larger commitment to pragmatism. He did not celebrate cruelty or deceit for their own sake. He celebrated them when they served survival, stability, or greatness. Force without cunning was reckless. Cunning without force was fragile. But combined, they formed a balanced, effective strategy for navigating the dangers of politics. We can also see in this metaphor a reflection of Machiavelli's own life. As a diplomat, he often played the fox, maneuvering through negotiations, observing rivals, writing sharp reports that revealed the hidden motives of others. But when the Medici returned, he found himself powerless, unable to be the lion who defends himself by force. His writings, then, can be read as both analysis and confession. He knew what was required, but fortune denied him the chance to embody it fully. For those who lead in any sphere, the fox and the lion remain vivid reminders of the dual nature of power. Strength without cunning becomes bluster. Cunning without strength becomes manipulation. But together they create a formidable presence capable of both deterring enemies and outwitting rivals. Machiavelli's brilliance was to condense this truth into an image so simple yet so profound that it has endured for centuries. In the end, the metaphor is not about animals, but about adaptability. The world is unpredictable, people are unreliable, and fortune is fickle. Leaders who survive are those who can shift between roles, who know when to roar and when to slink, when to strike openly and when to deceive subtly. To be only one thing is to be brittle, to be both is to endure. One of the most unsettling insights in Machiavelli's philosophy is his insistence that appearances matter more than reality. In The Prince, he states bluntly that it is unnecessary for a ruler to possess all the traditional virtues, generosity, faith, compassion, honesty, but it is essential to appear to possess them. People judge by what they see, not by what is. The wise ruler understands this, cultivating an image of virtue even while practicing whatever measures are necessary behind the scenes. This was not cynicism for its own sake. It was, for Machiavelli, a recognition of how human beings actually behave. Most people, he argued, are concerned with appearances. They lack the time, the access, or the desire to probe deeply into reality. They judge leaders by outward displays, ceremonies, and reputations. A ruler who appears virtuous secures loyalty, inspires confidence, and gains legitimacy. A ruler who appears cruel or deceitful risks revolt. Thus, even when deceit or cruelty is necessary, it must be masked with the appearance of virtue. Here, Machiavelli breaks decisively with the moral traditions of political thought. Earlier writers had urged rulers to embody justice, mercy, and faithfulness sincerely. Machiavelli, by contrast, reduced these to tools of political theater. Virtue, in his account, is less a matter of inner character than of outward performance. What matters is not being merciful, but being seen as merciful, not being faithful, but being seen as faithful. The gulf between appearance and reality becomes central to political survival. He illustrated this with examples from history. Successful rulers, he noted, often cloaked their ruthlessness in the language of justice. They used religion, ceremony, and spectacle to present themselves as protectors of the common good, even as they pursued self-interest. Those who failed to manage appearances, who allowed their cruelty to be seen too plainly, or who appeared weak when they were strong, invited ruin. Perception became a battlefield as important as armies or laws. For Machiavelli, this was not hypocrisy, but necessity. Human beings, he believed, cannot be ruled by naked truth. They require illusions, symbols, and appearances to hold them together. Leaders who insist on being perfectly honest, who reveal every harsh measure, who scorn the power of appearances, will be destroyed by rivals who understand the game better. Politics is not the realm of saints, but of actors, and the stage is public opinion. This emphasis on appearances resonates deeply with modern experience. In politics today, we see how image often outweighs substance. A leader's reputation, their charisma, their ability to project strength or compassion, frequently matters more than the actual details of their policy. A scandal may ruin a career not because the deed itself was unprecedented, but because it shattered the appearance of integrity. Likewise, a leader may survive repeated failures if they maintain the appearance of decisiveness and confidence. Machiavelli anticipated this dynamic centuries before the age of mass media. What unsettles us is his candor. We may prefer to believe that substance outweighs image, that truth inevitably triumphs over illusion. Machiavelli confronts us with the harder reality. Illusions often triumph, and appearances often determine outcomes. This does not mean that truth is irrelevant. Reality eventually asserts itself. But in the meantime, perception shapes the field on which reality is contested. A ruler who loses control of appearances loses power, no matter how capable they may be in substance. Machiavelli's insight also explains why he emphasized adaptability. Appearances must be carefully managed because they change with circumstances. A ruler who appears generous in times of abundance may appear reckless in times of scarcity. A ruler who appears merciful during peace may appear weak during war. The art of politics lies in knowing which appearances to project in which circumstances. It is a performance, but a performance with real consequences. This does not mean Machiavelli dismissed the importance of actual deeds. Actions still mattered, but they mattered as much for how they were perceived as for what they accomplished. A harsh punishment might be necessary, but if carried out in a way that preserved the appearance of justice, it could strengthen a ruler's position. A victory in war might depend as much on how it was presented to the people as on its actual strategic value. Reputation was a form of power in itself, shaping the expectations and loyalties of others. Here again, his realism cuts against comforting illusions. We might wish that sincerity were enough, that leaders who are genuinely virtuous would naturally succeed. But history shows otherwise. Many sincere leaders have fallen because they failed to manage appearances, while many ruthless leaders have endured by cloaking themselves in the trappings of virtue. Machiavelli forces us to confront this disparity. The world judges not the hidden heart, but the visible mask. For ordinary citizens, this can be disheartening. It suggests that we are easily deceived, that our judgments are shallow, that we reward appearances more than substance. And perhaps we do, but Machiavelli does not condemn this, he simply observes it. To govern human beings, one must understand them as they are, not as we wish them to be. And as they are, appearances shape their perceptions, and perceptions shape their loyalties. Yet there is also a liberating dimension to this insight. It reminds us that power is not only about brute force or wealth, but also about persuasion, reputation, and performance. Leaders are not omnipotent. They are constrained by the images they project and the reputations they build. A ruler who loses credibility, who shatters the illusion of virtue, cannot endure for long. Appearances may be fragile, but they are also decisive. In the end, Machiavelli's teaching on appearances is both sobering and illuminating. It tells us that leadership is not only about deeds, but about image, not only about substance, but about perception. This may unsettle our desire for a world ruled by truth, but it clarifies the world we actually inhabit. To lead is to perform, to project, to manage the mask as carefully as the sword. Those who fail to do so, no matter how virtuous in reality, are undone by rivals who play the game better. By the time Machiavelli died in 1527, his name was already surrounded by controversy. His writings had circulated widely, passed from hand to hand among diplomats, princes, and scholars. Some read him with admiration, marveling at his candor and clarity. Others recoiled in horror, accusing him of stripping politics of its moral foundation, and of teaching rulers to be treacherous, cruel, and godless. Even in his own lifetime, his reputation was divided, admired by a few, reviled by many, and mistrusted by most. The most notorious of his works, The Prince, was completed in 1513, but not published until 1532, 5 years after his death. Yet even in manuscript form, it circulated among the powerful. Those who read it were shocked by its bluntness. Unlike the traditional mirrors for princes that urged rulers to embody Christian virtue, Machiavelli's book counseled them to embrace deceit, cruelty, and manipulation when necessary. He wrote not as a preacher but as a physician, diagnosing the real conditions of power and prescribing harsh remedies. For some, this was exhilarating. For others, it was abhorrent. In Florence, his reputation was deeply ambivalent. To Republicans who remembered his service before the Medici returned, he was a comrade who had shared their hopes for liberty. Yet they also remembered that he had later tried to ingratiate himself with the Medici, dedicating the prince to them in hopes of employment. To the Medici themselves, he was useful but never fully trusted, a man with talent but a history of opposition. He was caught between camps, admired for his skill, but distrusted for his loyalties. Among Italy's broader intellectual circles, he was recognized as original but dangerous. His willingness to place politics above morality challenged the very framework of Renaissance humanism, which sought to reconcile classical wisdom with Christian virtue. He seemed to many a corrupter, a man willing to separate necessity from justice, appearance from reality, power from ethics. In this sense, he appeared less like a humanist and more like a skeptic, one who cared not for ideals but for outcomes. The Church, predictably, regarded him with suspicion. Though he never directly attacked Christian doctrine, his analysis of religion as a tool of politics was unsettling. His critique of papal politics, his praise of Roman civic religion over Christianity, and his readiness to justify deceit all painted him as irreligious. In later centuries, The Prince would be placed on the index of prohibited books, condemned as immoral and dangerous. Even before that formal condemnation, the Church's silence toward him was telling. He was not celebrated as a moral thinker, but tolerated as a political one, and even that tolerance was uneasy. What makes his early legacy fascinating is the gap between his intention and his reception. Machiavelli had written The Prince partly as a bid for employment, dedicating it to the Medici in hopes of regaining political office. He did not intend it as a manifesto of evil, but as a manual of survival in the brutal politics of Renaissance Italy. Yet his blunt honesty, his refusal to veil advice in moral language, made the work scandalous. Readers could not forget its sentences, that it is better to be feared than loved, that appearances matter more than reality, that cruelty can be well used. These phrases echoed like thunderclaps, defining his reputation before the book even reached print. Ironically, his less shocking but more substantial work, The Discourses on Livy, attracted less immediate notoriety. There, he celebrated republican institutions, citizen armies, and civic virtue. It was a work of depth and vision, far more in line with the ideals of Renaissance humanism. Yet it lacked the sensational bite of The Prince, and so it did not define his reputation. The scandal of the shorter treatise overshadowed the substance of the longer one, branding him forever as the teacher of princes rather than the advocate of republics. This tension shaped his legacy in Italy. To some, he was a dangerous realist, stripping away illusions and revealing the world as it is. To others, he was a corrupter of morals, teaching treachery under the guise of wisdom. Few saw him as he saw himself, a patriot who loved Florence, a man exiled by fortune, and a writer who sought to turn his suffering into lessons for others. There is also a human element in how he was remembered. Those who knew him personally recalled his wit, his humor, his lively company. He was not a grim cynic, but a man full of energy, laughter, and stories. He could be bawdy, playful, and irreverent. His comedies delighted audiences, showing a lighter side of his genius. Yet in the political sphere, his reputation hardened into something darker. The public image of Machiavelli, the teacher of ruthless cunning, quickly overshadowed the private man who laughed with friends and struggled to provide for his family. This duality between the man and the myth began already in his own lifetime and only deepened after his death. The myth of Machiavelli as a sinister teacher of evil took root quickly, spreading beyond Italy to the courts and universities of Europe. His name became synonymous with duplicity and ruthlessness. Yet for those willing to read him carefully, a more complex picture remained. A man who admired republican virtue even as he counseled princes. A thinker who exposed corruption even as he was accused of spreading it. The scandal of his writings ensured that his legacy would never be neutral. He was destined to be loved or hated, admired or condemned, but never ignored. His contemporaries may not have fully grasped the depth of his insights, but they felt the shock of his candor. In that shock, his reputation was born. The true measure of Machiavelli's impact emerged not during his lifetime, but in the years that followed his death in 1527. He died in relative obscurity, still yearning for office, still burdened by disappointment. But his words, particularly the words of The Prince, took on a life of their own. As the 16th century unfolded, they spread across Europe, carried by printers, copied in manuscript, translated into other languages. With each new audience, his reputation grew, but not as he might have wished. He was not remembered first as a patriot or as a lover of Florence. He was remembered as the man who had stripped politics bare, who had told rulers to be ruthless, who had declared it better to be feared than loved. His name itself began to take on a darker meaning. By the mid-16th century, Machiavellian had become a word of condemnation. Preachers denounced him from pulpits. Moralists attacked him in print. He was described as the devil's counselor, the teacher of evil, a man whose book was a manual for tyrants and assassins. To many, he embodied everything corrupt about Renaissance politics, the duplicity, the betrayal, the cold calculation of power. His work was placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Prohibited Books in 1559, ensuring that, officially, at least, it was to be shunned as dangerous and immoral. And yet, even as he was condemned, he was read. His critics could not resist the sharpness of his insights, and rulers could not ignore the usefulness of his advice. The Prince was copied and translated, sometimes in secret, sometimes openly, making its way into the hands of monarchs and statesmen. Even those who denounced him often betrayed in their writings that they had absorbed his lessons. The paradox of his legacy was already clear: publicly reviled, privately studied. England provides a vivid example. Elizabethan writers made Machiavelli a stock villain in plays and pamphlets. Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta famously opens with a prologue spoken by Machiavelli, a personification of cynical deceit. In the English imagination, Old Nick and Old Machiavelli became nearly interchangeable terms for the devil himself. And yet, English rulers and their advisors read him carefully. The balance of power, the use of appearances, the management of reputation. These were lessons too valuable to ignore. In France, too, Machiavelli became a symbol of evil, even as his works circulated widely. Catholic polemicists accused him of teaching atheism. Protestants accused him of undermining morality. The very intensity of the attacks showed how deeply his ideas had penetrated. If he were truly irrelevant, there would have been no need to denounce him so loudly. The louder the condemnation, the clearer it became that his words had struck a nerve. The paradox deepened in Italy itself. The land of his birth, fractured and weakened, had seen firsthand the treacherous politics he described. For Italians, his works had the ring of bitter truth. Yet because of papal hostility, his writings were publicly suspect. Admirers studied him quietly, often disguising their references, while detractors accused him of impiety. He became both a source of national shame and a symbol of Italian brilliance, condemned as corrupt, yet admired for his fearless honesty. What disturbed readers most was his refusal to veil politics in moral or religious language. In an age when rulers justified their actions by appeal to God, Machiavelli had written as if God were irrelevant to politics. In a culture that prized virtue as the foundation of leadership, he had said it was often a liability. This bluntness made him seem like a corrupter, a man willing to set aside not only morality, but faith itself. His critics called him a pagan, a Satanist, even the Antichrist prophet. Few thinkers in history have been so demonized so quickly. And yet, underneath the denunciations, there was a fascination. The very fact that the prince was banned only increased its allure. To read Machiavelli became a mark of daring, a way of glimpsing forbidden truths. Statesmen could denounce him in public and quote him in private. Intellectuals could call him a corrupter, while quietly acknowledging the force of his analysis. His reputation as the devil's teacher ensured that his name would never fade. By the end of the 16th century, his fate was sealed. Machiavellian had entered the European vocabulary as a synonym for cunning, treachery, and unscrupulous manipulation. It was a word hurled as an insult, a label of condemnation. Yet at the same time, it became a badge of realism. To call someone Machiavellian was to accuse them of deceit, but also to acknowledge their effectiveness. His name became not only a moral warning, but a recognition of power. This dual legacy, reviled and revered, condemned and consulted, would follow him for centuries. In life, Machiavelli had longed for recognition as a statesman. In death, he became something stranger, a myth, a symbol, a name that carried the weight of fear and fascination. His contemporaries and immediate successors could not agree whether he was a corrupter or a truth-teller, a devil or a patriot. What they agreed on was that he mattered. His words had cut too deep to be ignored. The 16th and 17th centuries were an age of turbulent politics. Monarchs rose and fell, empires expanded and collapsed, and wars of religion tore apart Christendom. In this climate, Machiavelli's ideas, though officially condemned, found fertile ground. His writings became a kind of underground manual for rulers, diplomats, and advisors who needed to navigate the shifting currents of power. Publicly, princes might denounce his name, insisting on their piety and virtue. Privately, they acted as foxes and lions, practicing precisely what he had counseled. Few figures embodied this paradox more vividly than Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France and mother of several French kings. A daughter of the Florentine Medici, Catherine grew up in the same cultural world that had shaped Machiavelli. When she married into the French royal family, she carried with her the lessons of Italian politics, a world of intrigue, shifting alliances, and constant peril. As queen and regent, she ruled in a time of religious civil war, when Catholics and Protestants were locked in brutal conflict. Catherine's reign was marked by ruthless pragmatism. She employed marriage alliances, secret negotiations, and calculated shows of force to maintain the fragile survival of the monarchy. To her critics, she was a schemer, a manipulator, even a poisoner. To her defenders, she was a realist, doing what was necessary to preserve her son's throne in impossible circumstances. Her policies, blending deception with force, have often been described as Machiavellian. Not because she read Machiavelli directly, though she almost certainly did, but because she embodied the fox and the lion in practice. This was the wider pattern across Europe. As the old medieval order gave way to the modern system of sovereign states, rulers increasingly acted in ways that mirrored Machiavelli's advice. They balanced alliances, practiced deception, and prioritized survival over virtue. The concept of reason of state, the idea that the preservation of the state justifies actions that might otherwise be condemned, became central to political thought. While Machiavelli had not invented this principle, he had articulated it with unmatched candor, and now it guided the policies of Europe's most powerful rulers. In Spain, the Habsburg monarchy justified wars and intrigues in the name of defending Catholicism, yet their diplomacy often followed Machiavellian logic, making and breaking treaties as circumstances demanded, using religion as a political tool, and placing dynastic survival above all. In England, Elizabeth I presented herself as a virtuous Protestant queen, beloved and merciful, while practicing the arts of deception and espionage to outmaneuver Catholic powers. Her reign was a masterclass in the manipulation of appearances, a page torn straight from Machiavelli's book. The rise of balance of power politics in Europe also reflected his influence. Machiavelli had emphasized that states must always be vigilant against rivals, that alliances shift, and that peace is only temporary. European diplomacy in the 17th century embodied this lesson. No power could dominate for long without provoking coalitions against it. Wars and treaties reshaped the continent, and rulers who survived were those who understood that alliances were tools, not friendships. To act otherwise was to invite ruin. Even in the New World, Machiavelli's shadow reached. The brutal realities of conquest in the Americas, the deception of indigenous leaders, the use of force and spectacle to secure control, the manipulation of appearances to maintain authority, followed patterns he would have recognized. Conquistadors often cloaked their actions in the language of religion, but beneath the rhetoric lay the same logic. Survival demanded ruthlessness, and appearances mattered more than truth. What is striking in all this is the disjunction between rhetoric and reality. Publicly, rulers invoked God, justice, and virtue. Privately, they practiced Machiavellian statecraft. The gap between appearance and reality widened, and Machiavelli's reputation as a corrupter of morals only grew. Yet the very universality of the practices he described suggests that he had merely given voice to what rulers already knew but dared not admit. He was not the inventor of deceit, he was its most honest analyst. In this sense, his influence was both direct and indirect. Direct, in that his writings circulated among educated elites, informing their thinking about politics. Indirect, in that even those who never read him practiced his principles instinctively, because the conditions of power made them unavoidable. The fox and the lion, the power of appearances, the balance between fortune and virtue. These were not abstract concepts, but daily realities for rulers navigating a violent and unstable world. By the 17th century, Machiavellian had become not only an insult, but also a recognition of political skill. Statesmen might disavow the name, but they quietly embodied the practice. the diplomat who deceived an enemy while preserving an alliance, the monarch who staged a display of mercy while plotting revenge, the general who combined ruthlessness with cunning. All were Machiavellian in the sense that they lived by the rules he had described. His realism became the hidden grammar of politics. For Machiavelli himself, this posthumous role would have been bittersweet. He had hoped to be remembered as a servant of Florence, as a thinker who revived the glory of Republican Rome, as a patriot who loved liberty. Instead, his legacy was entangled with monarchs and ministers across Europe, many of whom he would have despised. Yet the irony is fitting. His writings were too sharp, too penetrating, to be confined to one city or one cause. They belonged to the whole world of power. What we see in this period is the transformation of Machiavelli from man to myth, from Florentine exile to European archetype. His words, once whispered in manuscripts, now shape the conduct of kings and queens, generals and diplomats. He became a presence in the halls of power, both denounced and imitated, feared and admired. Few thinkers have achieved such a paradoxical fate, rejected in name, indispensable in practice. By the 18th century, Europe was in the midst of the Enlightenment, a movement that prized reason, progress, and human perfectibility. Philosophers, writers, and reformers sought to liberate society from superstition, to restrain the arbitrary power of kings, and to build political systems grounded in rational principles. Against this backdrop, Machiavelli's reputation took on new dimensions. For some, he was still the sinister Florentine who had taught rulers to deceive and oppress. For others, he was recast as a misunderstood patriot, a thinker who had laid bare the mechanisms of tyranny precisely so that republics could resist it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was among the most important of those who attempted to reclaim Machiavelli. In his Social Contract, 1762, Rousseau argued that The Prince should not be read as a handbook for tyrants, but as a warning to peoples. Machiavelli, Rousseau suggested, wrote not to flatter rulers, but to expose their methods. By revealing how princes deceive and manipulate, he armed citizens with the knowledge they needed to protect their liberty. For Rousseau, The Prince was less a manual of tyranny than a satire, a dark mirror held up to power, forcing readers to see its corruption clearly. This reinterpretation was striking. It turned Machiavelli from a villain into a secret ally of liberty. Rather than condemning him as immoral, Rousseau elevated him as a truth-teller, whose apparent cynicism served a higher purpose. Whether or not Machiavelli intended The Prince as satire, Rousseau's reading helped rescue him from the stigma of being merely the devil's teacher. It opened the possibility that his realism could serve republican virtue, not just princely power. Other Enlightenment thinkers, however, remained skeptical. Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws, 1748, recognized Machiavelli's insight but worried about its implications. Montesquieu admired Rome's republican institutions much as Machiavelli had, but he believed that liberty required a careful balance of powers and the restraint of ambition. Machiavelli's embrace of cunning and force seemed, to Montesquieu, too dangerous. A system built on deception could not foster lasting liberty. Still, Montesquieu acknowledged Machiavelli's brilliance as an observer of history and politics, even as he tried to channel that brilliance into more moderate conclusions. Voltaire, with his characteristic wit, was harsher. He mocked Machiavelli as a man who revealed the worst about politics without offering solutions. For Voltaire, who championed reason, tolerance, and enlightened despotism, Machiavelli's apparent celebration of deceit was both distasteful and counterproductive. Yet even Voltaire could not ignore him. He acknowledged that Machiavelli had captured truths about the brutality of Renaissance Italy, even if those truths were unpalatable to Enlightenment optimism. Beyond these great names, Machiavelli became a reference point across Europe. Radical Republicans admired his analysis of Rome and his distrust of corruption. Monarchists, paradoxically, sometimes read The Prince as justification for strong, centralized rule. His writings were cited in debates about liberty, tyranny, and the responsibilities of rulers. To reject Machiavelli was to reject realism. To embrace him was to embrace danger. Either way, he remained unavoidable. The Enlightenment's fascination with Machiavelli also reflected a deeper tension within its own project. On the one hand, Enlightenment thinkers believed in progress, in the possibility that human beings could grow more rational, more virtuous, more peaceful. On the other hand, Machiavelli's stark realism suggested that human nature remained selfish, fickle, and prone to corruption. Was history a story of improvement, as the philosophies hoped, or a cycle of decay and renewal, as Machiavelli insisted? This question haunted Enlightenment debates, and Machiavelli stood as the counterweight to their optimism. In some ways, the Enlightenment rescued Machiavelli from his reputation as merely a corrupter of morals. By reinterpreting him as a patriot and a realist, thinkers like Rousseau made it possible to see him not as a destroyer of virtue, but as a diagnostician of power. Yet in other ways, the Enlightenment sharpened his notoriety. For a movement that believed in reason and morality, Machiavelli remained an uncomfortable figure, a reminder that power often defies ideals, that cunning often defeats honesty, that fear often outweighs love. This ambivalence carried forward into the political revolutions of the late 18th century. The American founders, though more directly influenced by classical republicanism, echoed many of Machiavelli's concerns about corruption, virtue, and the need for vigilance. The French revolutionaries, who devoured Rousseau, inherited his sympathetic reading of Machiavelli as a patriot. And yet, when the revolution descended into terror, critics accused its leaders of being Machiavellian in the worst sense, ruthless, duplicitous, and willing to sacrifice morality for power. Thus, Machiavelli's Enlightenment legacy was double-edged. He was both rehabilitated and condemned, both celebrated as a hidden teacher of liberty and denounced as the philosopher of tyranny. What united these readings was the recognition that he mattered. Centuries after his death, he remained central to debates about politics, liberty, and morality. No other Renaissance thinker provoked such fascination or fear. In the end, the Enlightenment could not fully domesticate him. He remained a disturbing presence, an unsettling reminder that beneath the dreams of reason and progress, the realities of power still lurked. His fox and lion prowled in the background. His warnings about corruption and appearances whispered through the halls of debate. The philosophies might hope for a rational politics, but Machiavelli forced them to confront the enduring truths of human frailty. By the late 18th century, the old monarchies of Europe were under pressure from a new political spirit. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, liberty, and rights had planted seeds of change. In both America and France, these seeds burst into revolution. And though the revolutionaries cited Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau more often, the shadow of Machiavelli was unmistakable. His warnings about corruption, his celebration of civic virtue, and his unsentimental realism about power all found new life in the revolutionary age. In America, the founding generation was steeped in classical republicanism. They admired Rome's republic, feared its decline, and believed that liberty could survive only if citizens remained virtuous and vigilant. These concerns were pure Machiavelli. Though the founders rarely cited him directly, they shared his obsession with corruption, not merely as bribery or personal vice, but as the erosion of civic spirit. A republic could fall, they believed, not only to external enemies, but to the internal decay of ambition, faction, and luxury. This was the very lesson Machiavelli had drawn from Florence and Rome. John Adams, James Madison, and others wrote passionately about the need to guard against corruption in government, the dangers of faction, and the necessity of checks and balances. These ideas had multiple sources, but Machiavelli was among the most important Renaissance voices to articulate them. His Discourses on Livy, with its praise of Roman institutions and its warning about civic decay, resonated with their fears. Even when his name was not invoked, his themes were present. The American Constitution, with its careful division of powers and its attempt to channel ambition through structure, reflected the Machiavellian principle that one cannot eliminate selfishness, but must instead design institutions to manage it. The American founders also shared Machiavelli's suspicion of appearances. George Washington, for example, was acutely aware of the importance of reputation. His refusal to seize power, his resignation after the Revolution, and his carefully cultivated image as a virtuous citizen soldier all carried Machiavellian echoes. Washington understood that appearances of restraint mattered as much as reality, that the image of Republican virtue could bind citizens to the new order. Machiavelli had written that it was essential for rulers to appear virtuous, even if necessity forced harsh measures. Washington lived this insight, though in a far nobler form. Across the Atlantic, the French Revolution presented a more turbulent reflection of Machiavelli's thought. The revolution began with high ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, but quickly descended into conflict, faction, and bloodshed. Here, Machiavelli's darker lessons about power seemed to come alive. Leaders such as Robespierre insisted on virtue but relied on fear. The Committee of Public Safety, in its ruthless pursuit of enemies, embodied the Machiavellian principle that cruelty can be well used if it preserves the state. Yet in practice, the cruelty became excessive, and the terror devoured its own leaders. The revolution illustrated both Machiavelli's insights and his warnings. Fear may be more reliable than love, but unchecked cruelty destroys stability. Critics of the revolution frequently invoked Machiavelli's name as a symbol of its successes. To them, the guillotine, the betrayals, the manipulation of appearances, all were Machiavellian in the worst sense, yet admirers of the revolution saw another side. They viewed Machiavelli as a Republican patriot who had understood that liberty is always threatened by corruption and complacency. To them, his writings on Rome and Florence offered lessons for building a republic that could survive. The dual image of Machiavelli, corrupter and patriot, devil and teacher of liberty, was alive in revolutionary France. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, who rose from the revolution's chaos, showed traces of Machiavellian influence. He admired Roman history, manipulated appearances brilliantly, and combined the lion's force with the fox's cunning. His rise demonstrated Machiavelli's truth that fortune favors those bold enough to seize the moment. Yet his fall also reflected Machiavelli's warning. Fortune is fickle, and power won through conquest is difficult to sustain. What unites the American and French experiences is the way Machiavelli's themes resonated, even when his name was not always spoken. Both revolutions grappled with the tension between virtue and necessity, liberty and power, ideals and appearances. Both feared corruption as the great enemy of Republican survival. Both revealed the difficulty of sustaining civic spirit once prosperity or faction set in. These were Machiavelli's concerns centuries earlier, drawn from the ruins of Florence and the triumphs of Rome. The Revolutionary Age also ensured that Machiavelli's legacy would no longer be confined to Italy or even to Europe. His insights now shaped the founding of new nations, the overthrow of monarchies, and the birth of modern politics. Whether read directly or absorbed through intermediaries, his thought was present wherever people debated how to build and preserve liberty in a dangerous world. And yet, the revolutions also revealed the limits of his advice. Machiavelli had written in the context of city-states and princely courts. His lessons about corruption and appearances remained powerful, but the new politics of mass participation introduced dynamics he had not foreseen. The guillotine, the pamphlet press, the revolutionary crowd. These were realities of power that extended his insights into new and sometimes terrifying forms. Still, the fact that Machiavelli's voice could be heard in both the American Republic and the French Revolution underscores his universality. He was not simply a thinker for princes or Florentine republicans. He was a thinker for anyone who confronted the realities of power, the fragility of liberty, and the inevitability of corruption. His words, written in exile 5 centuries earlier, echoed in the declarations, constitutions, and speeches of a new age. The 19th century was a time of sweeping transformation. Industrialization remade economies, empires expanded and collapsed, and nationalist movements reshaped the political map of Europe. In this turbulent age, Machiavelli's name returned to prominence, not as a Renaissance curiosity, but as a prophet of modern statecraft. His insights into power, deception, and necessity resonated deeply with those who sought to unify nations or preserve empires in a rapidly changing world. The century's central political development was the rise of the modern nation-state. In Italy, long fragmented into city-states and small kingdoms, patriots dreamed of unification. The Risorgimento, the movement to forge a single Italian nation, became the great project of the mid-19th century. Here, Machiavelli's shadow loomed large. He had loved Florence, but had longed for a united Italy strong enough to resist foreign domination. His writings closed with passionate appeals for liberation from foreign powers. 3 centuries later, his dream became the rallying cry of Italian patriots. Giuseppe Mazzini, the romantic prophet of Italian nationalism, appealed to ideals of liberty, duty, and sacrifice. His vision was lofty, moral, almost religious in tone, but Mazzini's dream alone could not bring unification. That task fell to men of pragmatism, Count Camillo di Cavour, the statesman of Piedmont, Sardinia, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, the charismatic revolutionary general. Together, they embodied the duality of Machiavelli's lion and fox. Cavour was the fox. A master of diplomacy, he maneuvered between great powers, securing French support against Austria, manipulating allies, and balancing appearances to achieve Italy's goals. He cultivated the image of moderation while pursuing bold, often ruthless strategies behind the scenes. His politics were not guided by lofty ideals, but by necessity, a profoundly Machiavellian approach. Garibaldi was the lion, a man of action. He inspired troops with his courage, seized territory through bold campaigns, and embodied the raw strength of nationalist fervor. Yet even Garibaldi's heroics had to be tempered by diplomacy. Without Cavour's cunning, his victories might have unraveled. Together, the two showed that the unification of Italy required both the fox's cunning and the lion's force. Machiavelli would have recognized the pattern instantly. Beyond Italy, Machiavelli's influence appeared in the figure of Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany. Bismarck's practice of realpolitik, politics based on practical objectives rather than ideals, echoed Machiavelli's spirit more than any other 19th century leader. He united Germany not through romantic nationalism, but through calculated wars, shrewd alliances, and ruthless manipulation of appearances. He famously declared that the great questions of the day would be decided not by speeches and majority votes, but by blood and iron. This was pure Machiavellian necessity. Outcomes mattered more than ideals. Bismarck's diplomacy was a textbook in Machiavellian technique. He isolated enemies before war, secured allies through temporary promises, and always left himself room to maneuver. He cultivated the appearance of conservatism while pursuing radical change. He used nationalism when it suited him and suppressed it when it threatened stability. Like Machiavelli, he believed that politics was not about virtue, but about survival, not about sincerity, but about results. The term realpolitik itself reflects Machiavelli's legacy. While he did not coin the term, his insistence on looking at politics as it is, rather than as it ought to be, laid the foundation for it. Realpolitik meant to focus on power, necessity, and pragmatism, stripped of illusions. In the 19th century, as nations unified and empires jockeyed for dominance, this approach seemed not cynical but essential. Idealism alone could not withstand the pressures of industrial armies, economic competition, and imperial rivalry. Yet Machiavelli's influence in this era was not only political. The 19th century was also the age of literature and philosophy grappling with his ideas. Writers invoked Machiavellian characters to represent ambition and deceit. Philosophers debated whether his realism was compatible with the liberal ideals of freedom and progress. Some saw him as the necessary antidote to utopian dreaming, others as the enemy of morality in public life. Either way, his name remained synonymous with the stark truths of power. It is telling that both admirers and detractors found him useful. Nationalist leaders invoked his dream of Italian unity, while conservative critics accused revolutionaries of being Machiavellian plotters. Revolutionaries praised his republican writings, while monarchs used his advice on appearances and fear. His legacy proved adaptable because it was rooted not in ideology, but in observation. He described human behavior as it is, and so his lessons applied across ideologies and centuries. The 19th century also revealed the enduring tension in how Machiavelli was understood. Was he the advocate of ruthless tyranny or the prophet of national liberation? Was he a cynic who destroyed morality or a realist who taught hard truths? These questions persisted as Italy and Germany unified, as empires expanded, and as revolutions flared across Europe. The contradictions of his reputation mirrored the contradictions of the century itself. A century of idealism and pragmatism, of revolutions and realpolitik. In the end, what Machiavelli contributed to the 19th century was not a blueprint, but a sensibility. He reminded leaders that survival often requires harsh choices, that appearances matter as much as deeds, and that fortune favors those who act boldly. Whether in the diplomacy of Cavour, the campaigns of Garibaldi, or the strategies of Bismarck, his spirit was present. He had lived in a world of city-states, but his lessons found new expression in the Age of Nations. The 20th century was the most violent century in human history. 2 world wars, genocides, revolutions, and the rise and fall of totalitarian regimes reshaped the globe. It was an age that tested every theory of politics, every ideal of liberty, every system of government. In such a world, Machiavelli's name resurfaced again and again, sometimes claimed, sometimes condemned, always lurking in the background as the philosopher of necessity and power. In Italy, Machiavelli was explicitly adopted by Benito Mussolini. The fascist leader saw himself as the heir to Renaissance pragmatism, a man reviving Roman greatness in the modern era. Mussolini admired Machiavelli's patriotism, his call for a strong Italy, and his insistence that survival sometimes requires ruthless measures. In speeches, Mussolini invoked him as a national thinker, a Florentine who had seen clearly the dangers of weakness. But the identification was selective. Mussolini ignored Machiavelli's republican commitments, his celebration of citizen militias, and his suspicion of corruption. What Mussolini embraced was the image of Machiavelli as the teacher of force and cunning, a figure who justified authoritarian power in the name of necessity. Adolf Hitler, too, has often been linked to Machiavelli, though here the association is more misleading. Hitler embodied cruelty without restraint, fear without balance, and appearances warped into propaganda. Machiavelli had warned that cruelty must be well used, that fear must not turn to hatred, and that appearances must be carefully cultivated to maintain legitimacy. Hitler violated these rules, and in doing so, he brought destruction not only upon others, but upon his own regime. If anything, the collapse of Nazism illustrated the limits of Machiavellian realism when pushed into brutality without measure. Machiavelli advised princes to be feared but not hated. Hitler ignored the distinction, and history judged the result. More nuanced uses of Machiavelli's thought appeared among democratic leaders who faced the extraordinary challenges of total war. Winston Churchill, for example, understood the importance of appearances. His speeches, his defiant posture, even his personal image as the Bulldog of Britain were as much performances as policies. He embodied the Machiavellian insight that leaders must appear resolute and virtuous, even when reality is grim. Behind the rhetoric, Churchill was pragmatic, willing to ally with Stalin to defeat Hitler, willing to make hard bargains for survival. It was the fox and the lion together, necessity clothed in inspiring language. Franklin Delano Roosevelt likewise displayed Machiavellian instincts, though tempered by democratic ideals. He projected optimism through his fireside chats, carefully managing the appearance of confidence even during the Depression's darkest days. He expanded executive power, often pushing constitutional limits, but always cloaked his actions in the language of popular necessity. His ability to appear both compassionate and decisive gave him extraordinary staying power. Machiavelli had said that rulers must learn to be not good, but effective. Roosevelt showed that in a democracy, effectiveness required the appearance of goodness as well. The Cold War that followed World War II brought yet another revival of Machiavelli's realism. The confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was not only ideological, but strategic, marked by espionage, proxy wars, and careful management of appearances. The doctrine of deterrence, the maintenance of overwhelming force not to be used but to be displayed, was deeply Machiavellian. It was the politics of fear, carefully calculated, designed to maintain stability through the perception of strength. Leaders on both sides practiced deception, covert action, and manipulation of allies and rivals. The fox and the lion stalked through the nuclear age, And yet, even as statesmen practiced Machiavellian politics, his name remained controversial. To be called Machiavellian in the 20th century was still an insult, implying deceit and ruthlessness. Intellectuals debated whether his thought led naturally to totalitarianism, or whether it offered insights for democracy. Some accused him of paving the way for fascism and dictatorship. Others argued that he had simply described realities that any political system must face. The century of extremes sharpened the stakes of this debate. In the United States, Machiavelli was sometimes studied in military academies and schools of diplomacy, not as a moral guide, but as a strategist. His emphasis on adaptability, on the need to match methods to circumstances, appealed to a world in which survival seemed perpetually at risk. At the same time, the civil rights movement and other democratic struggles stood as reminders that politics must aspire to more than survival. The moral critique of Machiavelli, that he reduces politics to power without principle, remained as urgent as ever. The 20th century, in its extremes, revealed both the brilliance and the dangers of Machiavelli's philosophy. Leaders who ignored his lessons about appearances, balance, and necessity often fell. Leaders who absorbed them selectively sometimes succeeded brilliantly. But when his insights were twisted into justification for cruelty without limit, the results were catastrophic. The century showed that Machiavellian realism is a tool, one that can be used for survival and stability, or for oppression and destruction. Its value depends on the wisdom and restraint of those who wield it. In the ruins of the Second World War and the tensions of the Cold War, Machiavelli's presence was undeniable. He remained a figure invoked to explain the harsh choices of politics, the deceptions of diplomacy, and the ruthless calculus of power. 5 centuries after his death, in a world he could never have imagined, his fox and lion still prowled the corridors of power, reminding leaders that survival often comes at the price of virtue. By the 20th century, Machiavelli was no longer only a controversial name in history. He had become something more enduring, a foundational figure in the modern discipline of political science and international relations. The questions he raised, about power, appearances, fear, and necessity, were now institutionalized in academic debates, taught in universities, and embedded in the language of diplomacy. Though 5 centuries separated him from the world of nuclear weapons, global trade, and international law, the essence of his realism continued to shape how scholars and statesmen understood politics. The defining feature of Machiavelli's thought, and the reason it remains central to modern political science, is his insistence on describing politics as it is, not as it ought to be. Where medieval thinkers framed rulership in terms of morality, justice, and divine order, Machiavelli asked instead, what actually keeps a ruler in power? What makes a state survive? That shift, from normative ideals to empirical analysis, was the birth of political science. It was the move from theology to strategy, from preaching to diagnosing. In international relations, this sensibility evolved into the school of realism. Realists argue that the international system is anarchic. There is no overarching authority above states, and therefore survival depends on self-help. Each state must rely on its own strength, alliances, and strategies, just as Machiavelli advised princes to rely on their own arms and institutions. Realists emphasize the balance of power, the inevitability of conflict, and the unreliability of moral appeals in the face of necessity. These are Machiavelli's lessons transposed to a global stage. Hans Morgenthau, one of the 20th century's most influential realists, acknowledged this lineage. In his classic Politics Among Nations, 1948, Morgenthau argued that politics is governed by objective laws rooted in human nature, particularly the drive for power. Though he wrote in the context of modern nation-states and nuclear rivalry, the spirit of Machiavelli animated his work. The emphasis on prudence, on the limits of morality and politics, and on the need to distinguish between appearance and reality, all echo the Florentines' insights. Of course, realism was not the only school of thought. Idealists, especially after World War I, hoped to build a world order based on cooperation, law, and morality. They emphasized the League of Nations, disarmament, and international agreements. To them, Machiavelli's pessimism seemed outdated, a relic of a violent past. Yet, when the League collapsed and World War II erupted, realism returned with renewed force. Once again, Machiavelli's fox and lion seemed more relevant than hopeful appeals to virtue. Even later theories, such as neorealism, which emphasizes the structure of the international system rather than human nature, bear Machiavelli's imprint. When scholars describe states balancing against threats, calculating interests, and manipulating appearances, they are applying principles he articulated centuries earlier. The terms may be new, but the logic is the same. Survival comes first. Morality follows only when it does not endanger survival. It is striking how often modern debates echo his insights. Consider the Cold War doctrine of deterrence. Nations amassed nuclear arsenals not to use them, but to appear strong, to instill fear, to prevent aggression. This was Machiavellian logic on a global scale. Or consider contemporary diplomacy, where leaders must cultivate reputations, manage appearances, and sometimes deceive allies as well as enemies. Machiavelli wrote that it is not enough to be virtuous, one must appear virtuous. Today, in an age of global media and instantaneous communication, that lesson is more relevant than ever. Yet modern political science also grapples with the dangers of pure realism. Critics argue that Machiavelli's vision, if applied without restraint, risks justifying endless conflict and mistrust. If every state assumes the worst of others, cooperation becomes nearly impossible. International institutions, human rights, and global norms seek to temper realism with morality, to prove that politics can aspire to more than survival. The tension between realism and idealism, between Machiavelli's bluntness and the Enlightenment's hopes, defines much of modern international thought. Machiavelli's influence also extends beyond the realm of high politics into the analysis of leadership, organizations, and even business. His emphasis on appearances, on the psychology of fear and love, and on the necessity of adaptability has been applied to corporate strategy and management theory. In boardrooms as well as battlefields, his advice resonates. Leaders must be flexible, cunning, and willing to act decisively when fortune presents an opening. What makes Machiavelli enduring is not simply the content of his advice, but the method of his analysis. He looked at history, observed human behavior, and drew lessons without moralizing. He treated politics as an art and a science, governed by patterns that could be studied and understood. This empirical approach is what modern political science claims as its foundation. Whether one agrees with his conclusions or not, his method continues to shape how scholars study power. At the same time, Machiavelli remains a deeply uncomfortable figure. His name is still invoked as an insult. His ideas still provoke moral unease. To study him is to confront the darker side of politics, the lies, the betrayals, the manipulation, the cruelty. Yet to ignore him is to risk naivety, to build theories of politics that collapse in the face of reality. This is why he remains essential. He is the hard voice, whispering that survival often trumps virtue, that power often decides what is possible. In this sense, modern political science carries forward the same paradox Machiavelli embodied in his own time. He is indispensable, yet disreputable, admired, yet condemned. His ideas are taught in universities and practiced in governments, yet his name remains a byword for cunning and immorality. He is the father of political science, but also its scandal. The irony is that this duality ensures his survival. If he were merely a cynic, he would be dismissed. If he were merely a moralist, he would be ignored. It is his combination of sharp realism and unsettling candor that keeps him relevant. He forces us to ask whether politics can ever be truly moral, or whether it must always be, at its core, the management of fear, appearances, and necessity. That question, as much as any of his specific maxims, is why Machiavelli still matters to the study of politics today. When Niccolò Machiavelli died in June of 1527, he was only 58 years old. By the standards of his time, it was not an unusually short life, but for him, it was a bitter one. He had witnessed Florence swing from Republic to Medici rule and back again. He had endured torture, exile, humiliation, and disappointment. And though he had written some of the most enduring works in political history, he died not as a celebrated thinker, but as a frustrated patriot, still yearning for recognition in his own city. The final chapter of his life was shaped by Florence's turmoil. In 1527, after the sack of Rome by imperial troops, the Medici were briefly driven from power, and Florence restored the Republic once again. For Machiavelli, this should have been the great moment of vindication, the return of the very government he had served with devotion in his youth. Yet the Republic's leaders distrusted him. His long association with the Medici during his later years, when he had written in hopes of regaining their favor, marked him as suspect. He had written The Prince in part to please them, and though the book was not officially published during his lifetime, its reputation was already spreading. For Republicans, it seemed evidence of betrayal. Thus, when Florence cast off the Medici in 1527, Machiavelli did not regain office. Instead, he found himself sidelined, distrusted by both sides. To the Medici, he had been too Republican. To the Republicans, too close to the Medici. He was, in the cruelest sense, a man without a patron, a thinker whose realism left him politically stranded. In his last months, he sought appointment to a government post, but the request was denied. He fell ill shortly after, and within days he was gone. Yet his burial was modest, without fanfare. The grand tomb that now bears his name, with the inscription, Tanto nomini nullum par elogium, no eulogy is equal to so great a name, was erected only in later centuries. He was simply another disappointed man of letters, remembered by friends but distrusted by the city he loved. There is a deep irony in this ending. Machiavelli longed above all for practical recognition. He wanted to serve Florence, to guide its politics, to shape its destiny. His writings were, in his eyes, a means to that end, a way of demonstrating his insight so that rulers might employ him. Yet in his lifetime, they brought him no power, no office, no reward. His greatest works circulated only in manuscript, passed among friends and patrons, but not yet published for the wider world. His Prince, the text that would make his name immortal, remained in the shadows, unprinted until 5 years after his death. He died without knowing the reach his words would have. And yet, there is another way to see it. Machiavelli had always insisted that fortune is fickle, that human designs are fragile, that greatness often comes not in life, but in what endures afterward. If his own political career ended in failure, his intellectual career was only beginning. His writings, ignored or mistrusted in Florence, would soon spread across Europe and define the study of politics for centuries. In death, he became more powerful than he had ever been in life. His fate reflects the gap between personal ambition and historical legacy. As a man, he sought office, security, and recognition. He received instead exile, suspicion, and disappointment. As a thinker, he gave the world a mirror of power so sharp and unsettling that it still commands attention 500 years later. Florence denied him, but history claimed him. For those who study him today, there is something deeply human in this contrast. We see not just the ruthless analyst of power, but the man who longed to serve and failed, who believed in his city yet was mistrusted by it, who wrote in exile with passion and desperation. His philosophy was about survival, necessity, and the frailty of fortune. His own life was the proof of those lessons. Machiavelli's death in 1527 closed the story of a man, but opened the story of an idea. The Florentine secretary, dismissed and dishonored, would become Machiavelli the legend, reviled as the devil's teacher, admired as the father of modern politics, debated endlessly as the most unsettling realist in history. His mortal body lay in Santa Croce, largely unnoticed, but his words began their march across time. When Niccolò Machiavelli died in 1527, Florence barely noticed. He was not celebrated as a genius or condemned as a villain. He was simply another dismissed secretary, another casualty of shifting politics. Yet within decades, his name became one of the most infamous in European thought. Few writers in history have experienced such a dramatic, posthumous transformation. In life, Machiavelli was a frustrated servant of Florence. In death, he became Machiavellian, a word that would forever change the language of politics. The publication of The Prince in 1532, just 5 years after his death, was the spark. To readers across Europe, the book was shocking. It stripped away moral and religious justifications for power, presenting politics as a realm governed by necessity rather than virtue. To some, this candor was enlightening. To others, it was terrifying. Very quickly, Machiavelli was branded as a corrupter of morals, a teacher of tyranny, even a servant of the devil. The Catholic Church placed his works on the index of prohibited books, and theologians denounced him as an enemy of Christian virtue. Yet condemnation did not prevent circulation. In fact, it fueled it. Rulers, advisors, and ambitious men read Machiavelli in secret, curious about his dangerous advice. The Prince became a kind of forbidden text, a book whispered about, hidden under desks, consulted in private. The very fact that it was banned gave it allure. And though few admitted to following it openly, its lessons seeped into practice. To denounce Machiavelli in public while imitating him in private became a pattern that would persist for centuries. By the 17th century, Machiavellian had entered common speech as a synonym for cunning, deceit, and ruthlessness. Playwrights used it to characterize villains. Politicians used it as an insult against rivals. In Elizabethan England, Christopher Marlowe's plays portrayed Machiavellian figures as dark manipulators, emblematic of ambition unchecked by morality. William Shakespeare, too, echoed his reputation in characters like Richard III and Iago, men who manipulate appearances, exploit weakness, and pursue power with chilling clarity. Machiavelli himself did not appear on stage, but his spirit haunted the drama of the age. And yet, even as the name became a byword for treachery, a countercurrent of admiration persisted. Some thinkers began to argue that Machiavelli was misunderstood, that his apparent cynicism was actually realism, and that his ultimate loyalty was to republican liberty, not tyranny. The tension between Machiavelli the corrupter and Machiavelli the patriot shaped his reception across Europe. In France, thinkers like Rousseau reclaimed him as a defender of liberty. In England, Republican writers such as James Harrington drew on his Discourses on Livy to argue for the balance of powers and the importance of civic virtue. The dual legacy of Machiavelli, as both villain and patriot, reflected the complexity of his writings. The Prince seemed to counsel ruthless rulers, while the Discourses celebrated the vitality of republican institutions. Was he a teacher of tyrants or a friend of liberty? The ambiguity ensured that he could never be neatly categorized, and it made him adaptable to different political climates. In authoritarian states, he was invoked as a manual of power. In republican movements, he was cited as a prophet of liberty. Jesuit thinkers wrote treatises refuting his ideas, emphasizing that morality could not be separated from politics. Yet in doing so, they often confirmed his relevance, for they acknowledged the unsettling truths he had revealed about human behavior. He was the dark mirror in which society saw its own contradictions. In the modern era, Machiavelli's legacy continued to evolve. In the 19th century, nationalists in Italy saw him as a prophet of unification, a patriot who longed for a strong Italy free of foreign domination. His final chapter in The Prince, calling for the liberation of Italy, was read as a stirring appeal to national pride. Statues were erected, tombs honored, and his reputation began to shift in his homeland from disgrace to recognition. The man once dismissed by Florence was claimed as one of Italy's great voices. In the 20th century, as we have seen, his name was invoked by dictators and democrats alike. Fascists embraced him as a realist, while liberal thinkers tried to reinterpret him as a critic of corruption. In academia, he was increasingly studied not as a corrupter, but as the founder of political science. His realism was seen as the foundation of international relations, his analysis of appearances as essential for understanding modern leadership. Yet the word Machiavellian still carries its sting. Even today, to call someone Machiavellian is to accuse them of cunning and ruthlessness, of manipulation without scruple. It is an insult that persists in popular language, even as scholars attempt to rehabilitate the man behind the myth. Few thinkers have so thoroughly entered the fabric of culture that their name becomes shorthand for an entire style of behavior. In that sense, Machiavelli's afterlife has outgrown even his writings. He has become both a historical figure and a cultural archetype. There is a profound irony in all this. Machiavelli longed for practical recognition in Florence, but received little. Yet, in the centuries after his death, his name traveled the world, shaping politics, literature, and culture in ways he could never have imagined. His personal disappointments were real, but his intellectual legacy proved stronger than fortune itself. His life was bound by the limits of a city-state. His name became boundless. Machiavelli's afterlife, then, is not only the story of a philosopher, but the story of a reputation. He became both hero and villain, both corrupter and patriot, both insult and honor. In this ambiguity lies his enduring power. He forces each generation to confront its own view of politics, to decide whether power can ever be moral or whether survival always demands something harsher. To study Machiavelli is to study not only a man, but the ongoing human struggle between ideals and necessity. 5 centuries after Niccolò Machiavelli set down his observations of power in Renaissance Florence, his words still strike with unsettling clarity. We live in a world of democratic institutions, global markets, and instant communication, yet the questions he raised remain the same. Is it better to be feared than loved? Do appearances matter more than truth? Can leaders afford to be good when survival is at stake? These questions may feel ancient, but they confront us every time we open a newspaper, step into a workplace, or reflect on the choices that shape our own lives. Consider modern politics. Campaigns today unfold under the relentless gaze of television, social media, and 24-hour news cycles. Leaders are judged less by the depth of their convictions than by their ability to project confidence, manage appearances, and control narratives. A stumble on camera, a poorly chosen phrase, or a scandal, real or fabricated, can undo years of careful work. He warned that leaders must appear virtuous, even if reality demands compromises. In an age where image travels faster than truth, his insight feels not only relevant but prescient. Corporate leadership tells a similar story. CEOs and executives face pressures not unlike Renaissance princes. They must guide organizations through uncertainty, manage competing factions, and ensure survival in a ruthless environment. Machiavelli's fox and lion metaphor finds new life here. Leaders must be cunning enough to outmaneuver rivals, yet strong enough to enforce discipline and inspire loyalty. Many business schools openly teach Machiavellian principles under the softer language of strategic leadership or competitive advantage. The methods may be cloaked in modern jargon, but the core remains the same. Adaptability, perception, and decisiveness often matter more than moral purity. Even in personal life, Machiavelli's realism resonates. Anyone who has managed a family, led a community group, or navigated office politics knows the tension between honesty and diplomacy, between kindness and firmness. To lead, even in small contexts, is to face the balance between being loved and being respected, between accommodating others and drawing lines. Machiavelli's lesson is not that we should abandon morality, but that we should recognize the costs of clinging to it blindly. His writing asks whether goodness without effectiveness is truly good at all. For many, this is precisely why Machiavelli unsettles us. We want to believe that leadership can be both moral and effective, that honesty and kindness will triumph in the long run. And often they do, but not always. History, business, and even our own experiences tell us that the world rewards adaptability, toughness, and the ability to play appearances to advantage. To confront Machiavelli is to confront the possibility that morality alone cannot protect us, and that survival sometimes demands choices we would rather avoid. At the same time, Machiavelli's relevance today lies not only in his blunt realism, but in the warning embedded within it. He wrote not to celebrate cruelty, but to reveal its dangers when misused. He distinguished between fear and hatred, urging leaders to avoid the latter at all costs. He warned that cruelty, if excessive, corrodes legitimacy. He emphasized that corruption is the great enemy of republics, a lesson that resonates in every democracy struggling with cynicism, polarization, and the erosion of trust. His advice, though harsh, was often a call to prudence. Use force sparingly, guard appearances carefully, and never forget that power without legitimacy cannot endure. For those in midlife and beyond, his thought also speaks to deeper themes of mortality and legacy. Machiavelli himself died disappointed, denied the recognition he craved. Yet his words outlived him, shaping centuries of political thought. His life reminds us that the measure of a person may not be found in immediate success, but in what endures. As we reflect on our own choices, our careers, families, and contributions, it is worth asking, do we seek to be loved in the moment, or to be respected in the long run? Do we cling to appearances, or do we confront reality as it is? Machiavelli's philosophy is not only about rulers, it is about anyone grappling with the balance between ideals and survival, between short-term comfort and long-term consequence. It is tempting to dismiss him as too harsh, too cynical, too willing to abandon virtue. But perhaps the real service he provides is honesty. He tells us what others prefer to leave unsaid, that human beings are fickle, that appearances matter, that fear is often more reliable than love. We may reject his conclusions, but we cannot dismiss the truths he exposes. His enduring relevance lies in this discomfort. He forces us to look at politics, leadership, and life without illusions, and then to decide how much of his realism we are willing to accept. In this sense, Machiavelli remains a teacher, an uncomfortable teacher, but one we still need. He reminds us that power, whether in the halls of government or in the dynamics of family and work, is always entangled with human weakness. He insists that survival requires adaptability, that appearances cannot be ignored, and that fortune favors those willing to act boldly. His lessons are not moral guides, but tools, and it is up to us to decide how to use them. 5 centuries on, Niccolò Machiavelli still speaks to us. He speaks when a leader rises or falls on the strength of perception. He speaks when a corporation thrives by adapting to changing markets. He speaks when we ourselves make hard choices about how to balance kindness with firmness, honesty with diplomacy, ideals with necessity. He may not tell us what we want to hear, but he tells us what we need to confront. That, perhaps, is the true measure of his relevance. Niccolò Machiavelli's life was a tapestry of contradictions. He was a servant of the Republic who wrote a book for princes. He was a patriot who died distrusted by his own city. He was a realist condemned as a cynic, a writer of genius who never held power again after exile. His own life seemed to embody the very themes he wrote about: the unpredictability of fortune, the fragility of human plans, and the harsh truth that appearances often matter more than reality. And yet, across 5 centuries, his words have endured. Few thinkers have left such a profound mark on how we understand politics, power, and leadership. To read Machiavelli is to enter into a conversation not only with Renaissance Florence, but with the very structure of human affairs. His insights do not belong only to a past age. They speak wherever power exists, in governments, in corporations, in families, in communities. His lessons extend wherever human beings struggle with the balance between survival and virtue. At the heart of Machiavelli's philosophy lies a single, uncomfortable truth. Politics is not a realm of ideals, but of necessity. Leaders are not judged by what they intend, but by what they achieve. Morality may guide them, but survival demands flexibility. Love is fragile, fear more reliable. Appearances are indispensable, truth often secondary. It is a vision that strips politics of illusions and forces us to see it as it is. This does not mean that Machiavelli dismissed morality altogether. Rather, he shifted its place. He argued that a ruler who clings to goodness in all things will be ruined in a world where others do not. But he also warned that cruelty must be measured, that fear must not turn to hatred, that corruption destroys republics from within. His lessons were not a license for brutality, but a call for prudence, a recognition that human affairs require both firmness and restraint. What makes Machiavelli unsettling is that he does not give us the comfort of certainty. He does not promise that virtue will prevail, nor that cynicism always wins. Instead, he tells us that fortune is unpredictable, that human beings are fickle, that necessity demands flexibility. He forces us to live in the tension between ideals and reality. In this way, he is less a guide who tells us what to do, and more a mirror who shows us what is at stake. His life reinforces this lesson. Machiavelli longed for office, craved recognition, and offered his talents to both Republic and Medici alike. Yet he died without honor, his writings unpublished, his ambitions unrealized. And still, his words outlived him, shaping centuries of debate. His personal failure became intellectual triumph. His fate is a reminder that legacy is not always measured by immediate success, but by what endures beyond our own time. For an audience reflecting on life's arc, on aging, responsibility, and the choices that define us, Machiavelli offers a sobering perspective. He reminds us that appearances matter, that strength and cunning are necessary, and that fortune rarely favors the passive. But he also shows that even in disappointment, one's voice can carry forward. His life speaks to the unpredictability of legacy. We cannot control how we will be remembered, but we can shape what we leave behind. Today, when we see leaders balancing truth and image, when we witness politics entangled in spin and strategy, when we ourselves weigh honesty against diplomacy in our personal lives, Machiavelli is there. He whispers that power is fragile, that human beings are inconsistent, that survival is never guaranteed. We may resist his conclusions, but we cannot escape his relevance. Why, then, does Machiavelli still matter? Because he forces us to confront the hardest questions. Can politics ever be moral, or is it always the art of survival? Can leaders afford to be loved, or must they settle for fear? Can we live by ideals without ignoring necessity? They are questions that reach into the choices of nations, and the choices of individuals alike. In the end, Machiavelli does not offer answers so much as a framework for reflection. He shows us that power is entangled with appearances, that necessity often overrides virtue, and that fortune is fickle. To engage with him is to wrestle with the contradictions of human life itself, between what we want and what we must do, between the legacy we seek and the fate we receive. Niccolo Machiavelli, the disappointed secretary of Florence, became one of history's most enduring teachers. He teaches us not to trust illusions, not to cling to easy morality, not to ignore the realities of power. But he also teaches us the fragility of fortune and the enduring power of words. He died without honor, yet his name became immortal. In his life and in his thought, he reminds us that human affairs are never simple, never clean, never free of contradiction. 500 years later, Machiavelli still speaks. He speaks to rulers and to citizens, to scholars and to ordinary people, to anyone who has struggled with the balance of ideals and survival. His words unsettle us because they are true, and they endure because the struggle they describe is eternal. That is why Machiavelli still matters.